Hello there, and welcome to Tired Thinker, where curiosity slows down and the mind gets to rest. Tonight's quiet exploration drifts through the hidden corners of how our brain works and how it gently tricks us with cognitive biases. These mental shortcuts shape how we think, remember, judge, and choose. They help us make sense of the world, but they also lead us away from truth in surprisingly human ways. For the next 3 hours, we'll move through these biases slowly and calmly. No pressure, no overload, just soft explanations, simple examples, and little moments of, oh, I do that. This isn't a lecture, it's a gentle unraveling. You might stay awake and reflect, or drift off while your brain quietly listens. Either way, you're safe to relax here. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where are you listening from, and what time is it in your part of the world? It's comforting, isn't it? A video about the mind. And here we are, different lives, shared thoughts. If this helps you unwind, a like or quiet subscribe means a lot. Now, let's begin. Cognitive biases are mental shortcuts our brain uses to make decisions faster. They help us act without stopping to analyze every detail. They also lead us to make mistakes without realizing it. When we rely on patterns or past experiences, our brain fills in gaps. This saves time, but it also means we often jump to conclusions. These shortcuts shape how we see the world, judge others, and remember events. They influence what we believe and how we behave, even when we think we are being logical. Imagine you meet someone who reminds you of a friend you like. You may assume they are kind before knowing anything about them. That is the halo effect. One positive trait shapes your entire view. The opposite can happen too. If someone makes a bad first impression, you might overlook their strengths. Your brain wants a quick answer, so it grabs the simplest one it can find. Confirmation bias makes us focus on information that supports what we already believe. If you think a coworker is lazy, you notice every time they take a break, but ignore when they work hard. In a group project, you might defend your own idea and dismiss others without even listening. This bias can fuel arguments, because both sides feel certain they are right. It is not about facts. It is about protecting our beliefs. Anchoring bias happens when the first number or piece of information we see affects all later decisions. If a shirt is marked down from $100 to $50, it feels like a great deal. You forget that $50 might still be too much. The first number you saw anchored your judgment. This bias also affects salary negotiations, shopping, and even punishment in courtrooms. Availability bias makes us judge how common something is based on how easily we remember examples. If you hear about plane crashes on the news, you may think flying is dangerous, but flying is safer than driving. Plane crashes are rare but dramatic, so they stick in your memory. Your brain gives more weight to vivid stories than to statistics. This bias can shape public opinion and personal fears. The bandwagon effect makes us follow what others do, even if it goes against our own judgment. If everyone in your office agrees with a plan, you might go along to fit in. You assume the group must be right, or you worry about standing out. This bias helps explain trends, rumors, and even financial bubbles. People buy something because others are buying it, not because they need it. Sunk cost fallacy makes us stick with something just because we already invested time, money, or effort into it. You might finish a boring movie because you have already watched half of it. You might stay in a failing project at work because you spent months on it. Your brain hates wasting effort, so it pushes you to keep going, even when quitting would be smarter. This bias traps us in bad decisions. Hindsight bias appears after something happens. You look back and think the outcome was obvious. If a business fails, people say the signs were clear. If a team wins a game, fans claim they knew it all along. This bias makes us overconfident. It also causes us to judge others harshly. We forget that before the outcome, there were many possible results. Our memory rewrites the past to make it feel certain. Self-serving bias protects our ego. When something goes well, we credit our own talent or effort. When something goes wrong, we blame external factors. If you get a promotion, you think you earned it. If you do not, you say your boss was unfair. This bias helps us feel good about ourselves, but it can stop us from learning from mistakes. It also causes conflict in teams when people avoid responsibility. Projection bias makes us assume others think the same way we do. You might believe your friend wants the same type of vacation you want. You might think your coworker agrees with your values. When they act differently, you feel surprised or annoyed. This bias can hurt relationships because we fail to ask questions or listen. We assume our own perspective is normal and universal. Negativity bias makes bad experiences stick in our memory more than good ones. One rude comment can outweigh 10 compliments. After one failure, you might feel discouraged and ignore past successes. Our brain evolved to focus on threats, so negative events feel more important. This bias can affect mental health, decision-making, and relationships. If left unchecked, it can make the world seem worse than it is. In-group bias makes us favor people who belong to our group. A group could be a family, a team, a culture, or even a brand we like. We trust and support people who feel familiar. We judge outsiders more harshly. This bias fuels loyalty, but it can also cause discrimination. At work, it may lead to unfair promotions or tight cliques. We often do this without noticing. Overconfidence bias makes us believe we know more than we do. People often think they are better drivers than average or can predict stock prices. This bias can push us to take risks without enough information. It also shows up in planning. We underestimate how long tasks will take, which leads to missed deadlines. Confidence feels good, but unchecked confidence can be dangerous. Status quo bias makes us prefer things to stay the same. Change feels uncomfortable. At work, people may reject new tools even if they solve problems. In personal life, someone may stay in a routine that no longer works. The brain sees change as a threat and safety in familiarity. This bias can slow progress and innovation. To understand how multiple biases combine, imagine a manager choosing someone for a promotion. They like one employee because they remind them of a younger version of themselves. That is similarity bias. They remember one recent success and ignore failures. That is recency bias. They assume everyone else also sees this person as the best candidate. That is projection bias. They dismiss feedback from others. That is confirmation bias. The final decision feels fair, but it is shaped by shortcuts rather than balanced judgment. Biases are automatic. We cannot turn them off, but we can learn to notice them. When making decisions, we can stop and ask, what is influencing us? Are we reacting to the first piece of information we heard? Are we ignoring facts that challenge our belief? Are we following the crowd? Are we protecting our ego? Slowing down helps. Asking others for input helps. Writing down reasons for a decision can reveal weak points or emotional reactions. Biases are part of being human. They help us navigate a complex world quickly. In low-stakes situations, they are harmless. But in important choices, hiring, relationships, money, safety, they can cause damage. By paying attention, we can reduce their impact. The goal is not perfect logic, it is better awareness. When we understand how our brain works, we can make choices with more clarity and fairness. They save mental energy, but often lead us away from rational thinking. The brain likes shortcuts because they keep us from feeling overwhelmed. Instead of weighing every option, We jump to the quickest answer. It feels efficient, but these shortcuts bend our view of reality. They make us defend opinions, trust first impressions, and ignore facts that do not fit. One of the most powerful examples is confirmation bias. The confirmation bias makes us seek information that agrees with our beliefs. We look for support, not truth. Imagine someone believes a certain diet is the healthiest. They search online and click only on articles that praise it. They skip research that questions it. If their friend challenges the diet, they dismiss the comment or say the friend does not understand. Their belief feels stronger, even if it is based on incomplete evidence. This bias builds mental walls around ideas. It protects comfort, not accuracy. In daily life, confirmation bias shows up in quiet ways. You may think a coworker is unreliable. When they show up late once, you remember it for days. When they meet a deadline early, you forget by lunch. You are not trying to be unfair. Your brain is scanning for proof that your belief is correct. It prefers patterns it already knows. Once an opinion forms, your brain wants to keep it in place, even at the cost of fairness. This bias also shapes memories. If you believe you are bad at public speaking, you will remember the time you stumbled over a word. You will forget the times people said you did well. The bias edits your memory like a film, keeping the scenes that match your belief and cutting the rest. Over time, the negative story feels like reality. People often join groups that share their views. This makes confirmation bias even stronger. In a group where everyone agrees, opposing ideas sound dangerous. If someone speaks up, the group may label them as difficult. This keeps the bias alive and unchallenged. Online spaces work the same way. Algorithms show us content that matches past likes and clicks. Over time, the world shown to us shrinks. We start to believe most people think the way we do. In relationships, confirmation bias causes misunderstanding. A partner who believes the other does not listen will notice every distraction during conversations. When the partner pays attention, it feels normal and goes unnoticed. The bias pushes minor flaws into the spotlight while hiding signs of care or effort. This can turn neutral interactions into conflict. At work, confirmation bias affects hiring and performance reviews. If a manager believes a candidate from a well-known school must be talented, they search for traits that prove it. They overlook weaknesses. But if another candidate comes from an unknown background, the manager may notice every flaw. The expectation decides the outcome before the facts are weighed. This bias blocks diversity and innovation because it filters ideas through personal assumptions. In decision-making, confirmation bias can become dangerous. Picture a team planning a new product. They fall in love with the concept early. They gather data that supports the idea and ignore feedback that warns of flaws. By the time the product fails, the team is surprised. They think the warnings were rare. In reality, they did not let the warnings in. The bias made them blind. The bias also affects how we read evidence. If someone believes a certain medical treatment works, they will treat testimonials as proof. They will dismiss scientific studies that say otherwise. They might even claim the studies were biased. In courtrooms, jurors form opinions early and interpret testimony to fit those opinions. The same facts can lead to different judgments, depending on the beliefs people bring with them. When facing uncertainty, confirmation bias can block learning. If students believe they are bad at math, they see every mistake as proof. They stop trying, even if they could improve. If they believe they are naturally good, they may ignore errors and avoid practice. Either way, the bias locks them into a fixed view of their abilities. It limits growth. The bias also shapes how we judge risk. If someone believes flying is dangerous, they look for news about plane crashes. When they see a report, they feel their belief is valid. They ignore statistics that show flying is safer than driving. Their brain is not trying to find balance. It is trying to feel right. Feeling right often wins over being right. Social media amplifies confirmation bias. A person who believes a rumor clicks posts that support it. Each click tells the platform to show more of the same. Soon their feed becomes an echo chamber. Even extreme ideas can begin to feel normal. They may assume anyone who disagrees is uninformed or dishonest. Conversation shuts down. Division grows. Confirmation bias can even affect how we set goals. If someone believes a certain strategy always works, they refuse to change it. They search for wins and ignore losses. When the strategy finally fails, they assume the problem was temporary or caused by others. Instead of adapting, they cling to old methods. This slows progress and wastes effort. In politics, confirmation bias shapes how people vote, argue, and view opponents. Supporters of a candidate highlight every strength and excuse every flaw. Opponents do the reverse. Both sides feel certain they are objective, but their brain is filtering information before it reaches awareness. This creates overconfidence and hostility. People stop asking questions and start defending positions. Even experts face this bias. A scientist may favor a theory and test it in ways that confirm it. They might design experiments that support their expectations. Peer review helps reduce this, but the bias can still influence how data is interpreted. In medicine, doctors may rely on familiar diagnoses and overlook rare but accurate ones. Experience helps, but it can also strengthen assumptions. The confirmation bias is powerful because it feels natural. It rewards us with comfort and certainty. Questioning our beliefs takes effort. Listening to opposing views can feel threatening, but when we do not question, we build narrow versions of reality. We trust our first thoughts more than the full picture. We assume what we see is all there is. To weaken this bias, it helps to ask simple questions. What would prove me wrong? What evidence am I ignoring? How would someone on the other side explain this? These questions slow the shortcut. They create space for more honest thinking. Another helpful step is to seek out different perspectives. Talking to people with other experiences can reveal gaps we did not know we had. Imagine making a decision about a hiring choice. Instead of trusting your first impression, you could write down clear criteria before meeting candidates. Then score each one against those criteria. This reduces the brain's chance to bend the process. Or if you believe a project idea is strong, you could invite someone to challenge it, not to attack, but to test it. A tested idea is stronger than an assumed one. Our brain will always take shortcuts. They help us survive in a complex world. But when we let confirmation bias drive our choices, we trade accuracy for comfort. Noticing it does not make it disappear, but it gives us control. Awareness creates room for better judgment. When we look for truth instead of agreement, we think more clearly, act more fairly, and understand the world with more depth. The confirmation bias makes us seek information that agrees with our beliefs. When we hold an opinion, our brain tries to protect it. It filters the world so we only see what supports what we already think. This feels natural because agreement feels safe. We mistake that comfort for truth. Instead of testing our beliefs, we defend them. We search for proof that we are right and ignore anything that challenges us. This bias shapes our choices, our relationships, and even how we remember the past. Imagine you are sure a certain coworker is lazy. Each time they take a long lunch, you notice. Each time they miss a deadline, you talk about it. But when they stay late or help the team, you overlook it. You are not trying to be unfair. Your brain is keeping score in a crooked way. Over time, your belief feels stronger, even if the evidence is mixed. The confirmation bias taught your brain to highlight only the examples that match the story you already told yourself. This bias also affects how we gather information. Think about searching online. If you believe a specific diet works, you type questions like, why this diet is effective, instead of, does this diet have risks? You click articles that praise the diet. You avoid studies that question it. Even the words you use while searching are shaped by your belief. Your brain does not want answers. It wants support. You build a wall of agreement around your opinion. In relationships, confirmation bias creates tension. If you believe your partner never listens, every small distraction during a conversation proves your belief. When they give you full attention, it feels normal and you forget it happened. The bias spots flaws and hides effort. It turns one-sided moments into patterns. This makes problems feel bigger than they are and prevents open conversations. In school or at work, the confirmation bias limits learning. If you think you are bad at math, one wrong answer feels like proof. You replay the mistake in your head and ignore questions you got right. You avoid extra practice because you believe it will not help. The bias keeps you stuck. The same thing happens when someone believes they are naturally gifted. They ignore mistakes and skip feedback. Confidence without correction stops growth. In both cases, the belief shapes the result. Our memories are not safe from bias either. Suppose you believe you make poor choices. When a decision goes badly, you remind yourself of it often. Though you have made many good choices, those memories fade. Your brain edits your past until it fits your belief. You start to say, I always mess up, even if it is not true. The bias does not just influence how we think about the present, it rewrites the past. Confirmation bias also thrives in groups. People like to be surrounded by agreement. When a group shares the same belief, they reinforce one another. If someone raises a concern, they may be ignored or pressured to stay quiet. The group becomes an echo chamber. The bias grows stronger because disagreement is treated as a threat. This happens in workplaces, friend circles, families, and online spaces. Online platforms make confirmation bias more powerful. Algorithms show us content we already agree with. If you click on a specific type of post, the platform shows you more of the same. Over time, your online world becomes narrow. You might think everyone shares your opinions when they do not. When you finally see something different, it feels wrong or extreme. This fuels polarization because each side believes the other is unreasonable. In decision-making, confirmation bias leads to costly mistakes. Picture a team launching a new product. Early in planning, they fall in love with one idea. Instead of testing alternatives, they look for reasons to believe the chosen idea will work. When someone shares concerns, the team calls them negative. They collect data that fits the plan and dismiss signs of failure. By the time the product launches and fails, the team is shocked. They did not process the warning signs because the bias told them the plan was right. In leadership, confirmation bias affects hiring and promotions. A manager may believe graduates from certain universities are smarter. When they review resumes, they favor those schools. They interpret confidence as competence. They overlook other candidates with strong skills but different backgrounds. This bias closes the door on talent and keeps teams from growing. It feels like good judgment, but it is narrow thinking. In legal settings, the bias can affect fairness. Jurors might make quick judgments after hearing the opening statement. From that point on, they interpret every piece of evidence through that belief. They see what they expect, not what is accurate. Two jurors can hear the same testimony and come away with opposite conclusions. They are not lying. Their bias shaped their focus and memory. The confirmation bias also affects how we judge risk. If you believe flying is unsafe, you notice every news story about plane crashes. Each story makes you more certain. You ignore statistics showing flying is safer than driving. Your brain gives weight to stories that support your fear. It blocks stories that challenge it. The bias keeps fears alive even when they are irrational. Even experts are not immune. Scientists may favor theories they created, design experiments that confirm their expectations. They may overlook data that contradicts them. Peer review helps, but it cannot remove bias completely. In medicine, a doctor may see a familiar symptom and diagnose a common illness without checking for rare but serious conditions. Experience is useful, but bias can hide what matters. The confirmation bias is dangerous because it feels invisible. We do not notice we are doing it. We feel confident, even when we are wrong. We tell ourselves we are being logical, but logic requires testing beliefs, not guarding them. The bias makes us mistake agreement for truth. It shrinks our perspective and blocks growth. Consider a simple scenario. You believe a friend is upset with you. They reply to messages with short responses. You take it as proof and stop reaching out. What you do not know is they are stressed at work. Because you never asked, your belief hardens. The friendship becomes distant. The bias did the damage, not the friend. Assumptions built the wall. The confirmation bias also appears in how we interpret tone. If you expect someone to be rude, you read their neutral messages as rude. If you expect kindness, you read the same words as friendly. The bias affects not just what we see, but how we feel about what we see. It changes perception itself. Breaking free from confirmation bias takes effort. It means asking questions, even when the answers might feel uncomfortable. It means noticing the moment when we defend an idea without thinking. It means listening to people who see things differently. It means accepting that being wrong does not make us weak. It makes us more aware. Our brain wants certainty, but certainty can block growth. When we chase agreement, we stop exploring. When we choose curiosity, we see more of the world. Confirmation bias will always be part of how the mind works, but recognizing it gives us power. It opens the door to clearer thinking, fairer judgment, and better decisions. The availability heuristic makes recent or vivid memories feel more common than they are. When we try to judge how often something happens, our brain does not scan all possible facts. Instead, it grabs the first example that comes to mind. If that example is intense or easy to remember, we assume it happens a lot. This shortcut saves time, but it distorts reality. We end up fearing the wrong risks, trusting the wrong patterns, and making choices based on impressions instead of evidence. Imagine you see a news story about a shark attack. It plays on every channel with dramatic footage and interviews. The story sticks in your head. The next time someone mentions swimming in the ocean, you feel nervous. You think shark attacks must be common, but shark attacks are rare. Statistically, you are safer in the ocean than driving to the beach. Still, your brain does not care about statistics. It cares about the vivid memory. The stronger the story, the more real it feels. The same thing happens with plane crashes. They are rare, but news coverage makes them unforgettable. Each crash becomes a major story. Images of wreckage and interviews with witnesses make the event emotional. You rarely see news about the millions of flights that land safely. So when you think about flying, the scary images appear first. Your brain says, "This must happen often." The availability heuristic convinces you that what you remember most is what happens most. This bias also affects how we view crime. If you watch shows or videos full of violent incidents, you may think your city is unsafe. Even if crime rates are going down, the stories make it feel like danger is everywhere. You change your behavior, avoid certain places, or assume strangers are threats. You act on emotion, not fact. Businesses use this bias in advertising. A company might show one dramatic success story. They want you to think their product always delivers that result. You remember the story because it is emotional. You forget that it is not typical. The same happens with negative reviews. If one bad experience is described in detail, it outweighs dozens of quiet positive ones. Memory beats logic. Personal experiences also shape our judgment. If you get sick after eating at a restaurant, you might refuse to go back. Even if it was random, the memory is strong. You may even warn others the place is unsafe. If you nearly get into a car crash on a certain road, you start to believe the road is dangerous. You avoid it, even if the data shows it is no riskier than others. The availability heuristic gives power to whatever your mind can easily replay. Group conversations can reinforce this bias. Picture friends talking about job hunting. If one person tells a dramatic story about being rejected, everyone remembers it. Even if most people had normal experiences, the dramatic one dominates. The group may leave thinking the job market is unfair or hopeless. One vivid example becomes the whole truth. Doctors can fall into this bias too. If a doctor recently saw a patient with a rare illness, they might overestimate how common it is. When a new patient shows mild symptoms, the rare illness pops into mind first. The doctor might test for it instead of starting with the most likely diagnosis. Experience guides judgment, but availability can push it in the wrong direction. The availability heuristic shapes how we'll respond to danger. If a child falls off a playground swing and the story spreads around the community, parents might demand safer equipment. They imagine the fall happening to their own child. They forget that children play safely thousands of times without injury. The memory of one accident feels bigger than the many safe moments. Policies can change based on fear instead of frequency. At times, the bias affects how we view ourselves. If you remember a recent failure, you may believe you are incompetent. You forget past successes. If someone praises you once in a powerful way, you may believe you are doing great, even if your performance has slipped. The brain prioritizes what feels strongest, not what is most accurate. In relationships, one intense argument can overshadow months of calm communication. When you think about the relationship, the fight appears first. You feel like conflict is constant, even if it is rare. This can lead to resentment or doubt. If you only remember the worst moments, you make decisions based on a distorted view. The heuristic also influences how we judge others. If someone from a certain background does something harmful and the story sticks with us, we might assume people from that background are risky. We ignore the fact that most people from that group do not act that way. This bias feeds stereotypes and unfair treatment. Media plays a major role in this bias. The more dramatic a story, the more attention it gets. Natural disasters, scandals, crime, and accidents dominate headlines. Everyday events do not. So our mental library of memories is filled with the unusual, not the typical. When we judge what is normal, we rely on these stored stories. The brain compares what it recalls, not what actually exists. Even small patterns trick us. Say you meet 3 rude customers in one day. You go home believing customers are always rude, but maybe most were polite and you forgot them. The rude ones stood out because they triggered emotion. Availability makes us think recent experiences reflect long-term reality. This bias affects finances. If someone hears about a friend who made money on risky investments, they jump in thinking success is likely. They remember the win, not the many quiet losses. The same bias works in reverse. If someone loses money once, they may avoid investing completely. One vivid loss replaces all logic. The availability heuristic also appears in parenting. If parents hear one story about a child being harmed by a rare object or situation, they panic. They change rules or restrict activities. They are trying to protect their children, but they focus on the most memorable danger, not the most probable one. The bias feeds fear. Sometimes the bias even affects happiness. If the last few days were stressful, you might believe your whole life is stressful. You forget peaceful days because they were uneventful. When you judge your life, the vivid parts speak louder than the quiet ones. Your perception depends on what your brain can replay, not on a balanced view. To see how strong this bias is, imagine watching a movie about a courtroom case. If the defendant is emotional, you remember them. Later, when asked how often innocent people are punished, you think of that person. You believe wrongful convictions are common. The story guides your belief, even without data. This happens in politics, social issues, and everyday choices. The availability heuristic is not about intelligence. It is about how the brain organizes memory. Vivid memories are stored with more emotional weight. They come forward first. The brain assumes what comes forward fastest must matter most. It tries to protect us by reacting to what feels familiar and urgent. But what feels familiar is not always the truth. We can slow this bias by asking simple questions. Am I judging based on one strong memory? Do I know the actual numbers? Am I reacting to fear or fact? These questions interrupt the shortcut. They help us step back and see the bigger picture. Our brain will still offer the vivid memory first, but we do not have to let it control the decision. Awareness gives us room to choose with clarity instead of instinct. Anchoring bias happens when the first piece of information influences everything after. The mind grabs onto the first number, idea, or detail it encounters, and it becomes a mental reference point. Even when the anchor is random or meaningless, it shapes the way we think. We make adjustments from that starting point, instead of forming a judgment from scratch. The brain does this to save energy. Starting from something feels easier than starting from nothing. But this shortcut leads us to distorted decisions without us noticing. Imagine walking into a store and seeing a jacket with a price tag of $300. You think it is expensive. Then you see a sign showing a discount that brings it down to $150. Suddenly it feels like a good deal. The new price has not changed the quality of the jacket. The only thing that changed was your anchor. If you had seen the $150 price first, you might still think it is high. But the initial number sets the frame. Salespeople know this and use it. They start with the highest price so every discount feels generous. In salary negotiations, the first number on the table often sets the range. If the employer starts low, the candidate may settle lower than they deserve. If the candidate starts high, the employer might increase the offer beyond what they planned. Both sides are reacting to the anchor. Anchoring even affects simple estimates. If someone asks whether the population of a city is more or less than 2 million, and then asks for your guess, your answer will likely stay close to 2 million. If the anchor had been 10 million, your answer would shift upward. The anchor has no connection to the actual number, yet your mind cannot ignore it. It pulls your judgment toward it even when you try to resist. This bias appears in everyday life. A friend tells you a restaurant is amazing. When you go, you expect great food. If your first dish is good, you decide the whole place is excellent. If the first dish is bad, you assume the place is overrated. The first experience sets the tone. You judge everything else around that anchor. First impressions act as anchors too. Meeting someone who seems confident can make you believe they are competent before you know their skills. If someone seems awkward or quiet at first, you might assume they are unfriendly. Even after you see evidence of their true nature, the first impression sticks. You keep adjusting your opinion around that anchor instead of starting fresh. Anchoring can shape our view of ourselves. If a teacher once said you are average in a subject, that comment becomes an anchor. You measure every success or failure against it. You may hold back from trying harder because you believe there is a limit. If someone told you early in life that you are gifted, that anchor can create pressure. You might fear any mistake because it threatens your identity. Anchors do not just guide perception. They can trap us in fixed beliefs. In health decisions, anchoring bias is risky. If a doctor sees a common symptom and anchors on a typical diagnosis, they might miss something serious. They adjust their thinking slightly, but remain stuck near their first assumption. This can delay treatment. Even experienced professionals fall into this trap because the mind prefers to stick with the first idea it finds. Anchoring shows up in legal settings too. When prosecutors suggest a long sentence, judges often give harsher punishments than when the suggested sentence is short. Even when they try to stay objective, the anchor plants itself in the mind. Jurors also anchor on early evidence in a case. If the first witness seems convincing, later testimony gets judged through that lens. Anchoring shapes what people believe is fair or reasonable. In planning, anchoring causes the planning fallacy. People take the first estimate of how long a task will take and treat it as accurate. They may add small adjustments, but they do not consider hidden obstacles. Someone planning a home renovation hears 3 weeks and assumes it will be finished in a month. In reality, delays are common. Anchoring blinds them to the full range of outcomes. Money decisions are heavily influenced by anchors. When buying a car, you compare every price to the first one you hear from the dealer. If the dealer says the car usually costs $30,000 but can offer it for $28,000, you think you saved money. But maybe the fair price was $25,000 all along. The dealer anchored you high. The same happens when tipping, buying groceries, or investing. We compare to the anchor rather than to the actual value. Anchoring even affects how we view the past. If someone tells you a movie is terrible, you watch it with low expectations. If it is just average, you might think it was better than expected. If someone tells you it is the best movie ever, the same average experience feels like a disappointment. The anchor shapes satisfaction. One subtle form of anchoring happens in conversations. The first opinion shared can steer the entire discussion. If a team starts a meeting with someone saying a project is risky, everyone focuses on problems. If the first person says the project is exciting, the group focuses on benefits. The initial tone becomes the anchor for the whole conversation. This bias is hard to avoid because it happens below awareness. The first information enters quietly and sits in the background while we process everything else. Even when we know an anchor is random, we still feel its pull. In one famous experiment, people spun a wheel with random numbers, then guessed the number of African countries in the United Nations. Their guesses were higher when the wheel landed on a high number. They knew the wheel was irrelevant, but the anchor still influenced them. Anchoring also shapes social settings. If someone labels a person as difficult, others treat them with caution. The label becomes the anchor. Even when the person behaves kindly, others remain guarded. The first label lingers. The reverse happens when someone is praised early. Others overlook their mistakes because the anchor says they are reliable. In relationships, anchoring affects emotional memory. If the early phase was full of excitement, people may cling to that anchor even when things change. They adjust expectations slowly rather than see the new reality. Anchoring keeps them tied to the past. It can make them stay in situations that no longer work. We even anchor our sense of fairness. If you start a job at a certain salary, that number becomes your standard. Future raises are judged relative to it, not based on market value. If someone new earns more, you feel cheated, even if their salary is fair. Anchoring makes fairness subjective. The bias can make us resistant to change. If we learn something one way first, we struggle to accept new information. Early lessons become mental anchors. This is why myths and bad habits are hard to break. The first version of the story sticks the deepest. Anchoring also appears in comparisons. If a real estate agent shows you an overpriced house first, the next house looks like a bargain. They frame your perspective using the anchor. The same trick happens with subscription plans. Companies show a high-priced option to make the mid-priced one seem reasonable. You anchor on the high number and settle for the middle. Even when we know about anchoring, we still fall for it because the brain wants a starting point. The mind prefers to build around something rather than build from nothing. That starting point often becomes the silent ruler for all later judgments. Anchoring bias is not just about numbers. It is about first impressions, first offers, first ideas, and first labels. The initial piece of information is powerful because it shapes the context for everything that comes after. The mind treats it as the center of gravity. Every adjustment or judgment or opinion leans toward it. When we understand how anchoring works, we can pause before accepting the first thing we hear and give ourselves space to think beyond it. Hindsight bias makes the past feel more predictable than it really was. After something happens, our brain rewrites our memory of what we thought before the event. We start to believe we knew it all along, even if we did not. The outcome seems obvious only because we already know it. This bias removes uncertainty from the past and replaces it with false clarity. It makes complex situations look simple and makes us feel smarter than we were in the moment. Think about watching a sports game. Before the game, you might feel unsure about which team will win. During the game, the score changes several times and it seems impossible to tell who will come out on top. But once it ends, you look back and say the winning team was clearly better. You point to signs you now believe were obvious: a strong defense, a key player, a pattern in the first half. You forget that earlier, those same signs did not guarantee anything. The outcome shapes your memory of the process. The same thing happens in history. When students learn about major events, the story is told in order. Each event leads to the next, so it feels inevitable. But people living through those times did not see the future with such certainty. They faced confusion, doubt, and multiple possible outcomes. Hindsight hides the uncertainty. It paints the past as a straight line instead of a messy path. This bias also affects personal experiences. Imagine you apply for a job. You go through interviews and feel unsure. When you do not get it, you say you knew they were going to choose someone else. You tell yourself the interviewer seemed distracted or the tone felt off. But during the process, you were hopeful. Your memory shifts to match the outcome. If you had gotten the job, you might say the interviewer clearly liked you. Your brain edits the past to make it match the present. Parents often fall into hindsight bias. When a child makes a mistake, the parent might say the signs were obvious. They say they should have seen it coming. But before the event, the signs were probably mixed or unclear. Hindsight creates guilt because it makes people believe they ignored something that was not actually clear. It removes the context of uncertainty. In relationships, hindsight bias causes blame. When a relationship ends, people look back and claim there were red flags from the beginning. They think they should have predicted the outcome. But during the relationship, there were also positive moments and reasons to stay. Hindsight erases the balance and makes only the negative stand out. This bias can turn complex experiences into simple stories. In business, leaders often look back at failed decisions and say the warning signs were clear. They believe they should have known better. Advisors and critics do the same. After a company fails, outsiders point to specific choices and label them as obvious mistakes. But before the failure, those choices may have seemed reasonable. The market may have been unpredictable. Hindsight simplifies everything. Legal cases often deal with hindsight bias. In accidents or malpractice claims, people judge the decision makers based on the result rather than the information they had at the time. If a doctor made a reasonable choice with limited data and the patient had a bad outcome, hindsight makes it look like negligence. If the same choice led to a good outcome, no one questions it. The outcome controls the judgment. This bias also affects how we view risk. Before an event like a financial crash or a natural disaster, many possibilities exist. After it happens, people say it was obvious. They point to a few signs and claim they knew it would happen. They forget how many false signs appeared in the past without leading to disaster. They ignore the times the same signals meant nothing. The mind only connects the dots that match the final picture. Hindsight bias can make us overconfident. When we believe we predicted something after the fact, we start believing we have good intuition. We trust our instincts more than we should. We stop analyzing situations carefully. We assume future events will follow the same patterns, even when they will not. This overconfidence leads to poor decisions because we skip preparation and ignore warning signs that do not fit our imagined pattern. It also affects how we treat others. When someone else fails, we look back and say they should have known better. We judge them for not seeing what seems obvious to us now. We forget they did not have the knowledge we have in hindsight. This leads to unfair criticism. Hindsight bias makes us lose empathy for people facing uncertainty. This bias shapes memory. When you reflect on past choices, your brain updates what you remember based on what you know now. For example, if you invested in a stock and it went down, you may think you always felt unsure. If it went up, you may think you were confident all along. The memory changes to protect your sense of accuracy. The past becomes a clean story instead of a true record of your thoughts. Even minor situations trigger hindsight bias. Suppose you take a new route to work and get stuck in traffic. You say you knew you should have taken the usual route, but you made the decision because you thought it might be faster. Before you tried it, you did not know the outcome. After it fails, the bad result feels predictable. Students experience this bias when studying. Before a test, they may feel uncertain. After they see the answers, they think the material was easy. They believe they should have known it. This makes them underestimate the effort needed next time. They confuse recognition after the fact with genuine understanding. The bias appears in parenting decisions, friendships, job choices, and health issues. It shows up whenever we look backward. The brain prefers stories with clear causes. It does not like randomness. It tries to make sense of events by reshaping memory until everything fits. But life is rarely that neat. Many outcomes depend on chance, timing, or hidden factors. Hindsight bias also affects how we tell stories. When someone shares their success, they highlight the decisions that led to it and ignore luck or uncertainty. They make the path sound intentional and clear. Listeners believe the story and think the success was predictable. They try to copy the steps, not realizing how much was unknown at the time. The bias spreads from person to person. Even experts fall into this trap. Analysts explain market movements as if the outcomes were obvious. Historians write about wars as if the winning side had clear advantages from the start. Pundits talk about political events as if the results were expected. In truth, people at the time often felt unsure. Hindsight bias turns probability into certainty. It also makes people afraid of making decisions. If they believe they will later be judged for not knowing the obvious answer, they hesitate. They fear being blamed for missing something. But no one truly knows outcomes ahead of time. They only appear clear after the fact. Hindsight bias hides the real difficulty of predicting the future. This bias creates a false sense of control. When we think we could have predicted the past, We believe we can predict the future. We underestimate risk. We take on challenges without preparation. We assume things will go the way we expect, and we do not build backup plans. When things go wrong, the cycle repeats. We say we should have known, and the bias strengthens again. Hindsight bias is powerful because it feels like memory. It does not feel like distortion. It feels like clarity. It turns uncertainty into certainty and turns learning opportunities into blame. It sneaks into how we think, how we judge, and how we grow. Understanding it helps us stay humble. It reminds us that predicting the future is hard, and remembering the past accurately is even harder. The Dunning-Kruger effect occurs when people overestimate their abilities. It happens because the same skill needed to perform well is also needed to recognize what good actually looks like. When someone lacks knowledge in a subject, they also lack the awareness to see their own mistakes. They think they are doing better than they are because they cannot spot the gaps. The effect is not about arrogance or ego alone. It is about blindness to one's own limitations. The brain fills in the unknown with confidence, and that confidence feels real. Imagine someone who has just started playing guitar. They learn a few chords and can play a simple song. They feel proud, which is normal. But if they assume they are nearly as good as experienced musicians, they fall into the Dunning-Kruger effect. They do not hear the timing issues or sloppy transitions. They do not yet know how much skill it takes to play with precision. Without that awareness, their confidence grows faster than their ability. In the workplace, this effect shows up when someone with little experience feels ready to lead a project they do not fully understand. They think the task is simple because they have only seen the surface. They do not know how many variables exist or how many things can go wrong. The danger appears when overconfidence leads to risky decisions. They may ignore advice, skip planning, or dismiss more experienced voices. The lack of skill hides itself by inflating certainty. This bias also happens in academic settings. A student who briefly reviews a topic may feel prepared for a test. They recognize the information when they see it, so they assume they truly understand it. But recognition is not mastery. During the test, they struggle to recall or apply concepts. They feel surprised because their confidence was high. They did not realize how much depth the topic had. They mistook familiarity for skill. The Dunning-Kruger effect is not just about beginners. It also affects emotional skills. Someone with poor communication habits might believe they are great at listening. They interrupt often or dismiss others without noticing. Because they have never learned what good listening looks like, they assume they are doing it well. They may even give advice to others, convinced they have strong interpersonal skills. The effect hides the gap between perception and reality. The opposite side of the effect is equally important. People who are skilled often underestimate their competence. They know how much they do not know. They see the complexity. They assume others see it too. An expert might downplay their ability because the tasks feel easy to them. They think, if I can do it, it must not be that hard. They forget that years of practice made it feel simple. This creates an interesting twist. The least knowledgeable are the most confident, and the most knowledgeable often feel unsure. Think about someone learning chess. A beginner wins a few games against friends and feels like a strong player. They do not know strategy beyond basic moves. When they play against a skilled opponent and lose quickly, they are shocked. At first, they may blame luck. Only after more exposure do they understand how deep the game is. Their confidence drops as their awareness grows. This is why learning often starts with confidence, dips into insecurity, and rises again as ability improves. The internet amplifies this effect. People read a short article or watch a video and suddenly believe they understand complex topics like law, medicine, or economics. They make bold claims online and argue with experts. They do not realize how much information they are missing. They think experts are overcomplicating things. The Dunning-Kruger effect gives them false clarity. They feel certain, even when they are wrong. In health decisions, this bias can be dangerous. A person might diagnose themselves after reading a few symptoms online. They feel confident they know what is wrong. They may refuse to see a doctor or follow professional advice. They do not understand how many conditions share similar symptoms or how much training it takes to interpret them correctly. Overconfidence can delay treatment or lead to harmful choices. The workplace sees this bias in performance evaluations. Employees with low skills may rate themselves highly and react defensively to feedback. They think the feedback is unfair because they cannot see their mistakes. On the other hand, high performers may rate themselves lower than they deserve. They notice every small error and assume others perform at the same level. Managers who understand this effect can better interpret self-assessments and guide their teams. The Dunning-Kruger effect also influences leadership. A leader who overestimates their competence may micromanage or make unilateral decisions without consultation. They believe they have the best judgment. They may ignore warnings or underestimate risks. This creates problems for teams and organizations. The most confident voice is not always the most accurate. Overconfident leaders can cause more damage than cautious ones. In everyday life, this bias affects how we learn from mistakes. If we fail at something and think, "I knew it, but I just got unlucky," we miss the chance to grow. We blame external factors instead of reflecting on our own skill gaps. Hindsight can boost confidence by rewriting the past, which blends with Dunning-Kruger to make us believe we were more capable than we were. This blocks improvement. The effect also appears in social conversations. People may speak with certainty about topics they barely understand. Their tone convinces others, even when their information is wrong. Confidence can be persuasive. This creates a problem where the loudest or most certain person seems the most credible, even if they lack expertise. Society often rewards confidence over competence, which fuels the effect. Noticing the Dunning-Kruger effect in ourselves is difficult because the bias hides itself. If we lack skill, we also lack insight about that lack. But we can reduce its impact by staying curious. Asking questions, seeking feedback, and comparing our performance to clear standards can help. Humility protects us. When we accept that we might not know everything, we make room to learn. Growth often starts when confidence drops. When someone realizes how much they do not know, they feel uncomfortable. This stage can feel discouraging, but it is important. Recognizing the gap between what we think and what we know is the first step toward mastery. Skilled people are not those who think they know everything. They are the ones who recognize how much there is still to learn. The Dunning-Kruger effect is not a flaw in a few people. It is a natural part of how the brain works. We build our confidence based on our current knowledge, and if that knowledge is shallow, our confidence can reach too high. The key is to balance confidence with awareness. We can stay open to correction and ready to adjust our view when new information appears. When people become more skilled, their confidence returns, but it is grounded in experience. They see details, understand limitations, and solve problems with precision. They also respect other experts because they recognize the work it takes to reach that level. The gap between confidence and ability closes. The Dunning-Kruger effect reminds us that certainty is not proof of skill. Loudness is not proof of accuracy. Early success is not proof of mastery. To grow, we must question ourselves with honesty. We can ask, "What am I missing?" Or, "How do experts approach this?" Or, "What would it take to get better?" These questions shift us from overconfidence to awareness, and from awareness to true competence. Negativity bias causes us to focus more on negative experiences than positive ones. It is a mental habit built for survival. Long ago, noticing danger helped us stay alive. Missing a threat was costly, while missing something pleasant did not matter as much. Today, our environments have changed, but our brains still treat negative events as more important than positive ones. A single harsh comment can outweigh a dozen kind words. One mistake can overshadow years of success. The brain gives more weight to pain than pleasure and stores negative memories more deeply. Imagine delivering a presentation at work. Most people nod along and seem engaged. Afterward, several coworkers say you did a great job, but one person criticizes a small detail. Instead of feeling proud, you replay that negative comment all day. You question your performance, even though the overall feedback was positive. The negativity bias magnifies the criticism and shrinks the praise. This bias appears early in life. A child may remember the one time a parent scolded them more than countless moments of encouragement. The emotional sting makes the memory stick. As adults, we carry these patterns forward. When we enter new situations, we prepare for problems before expecting good outcomes. This can make us cautious, but it can also make us anxious. Negativity bias also affects how we interpret neutral situations. If a friend does not reply to a message, you might assume they are upset with you, instead of thinking they are busy. The brain fills in the gap with the worst-case scenario because negative explanations feel more urgent. This reaction can strain relationships. We may react to imagined threats and create conflict where none existed. In social settings, we often remember embarrassing moments more than times we fit in. If you trip in public, the memory stays vivid. If you walk confidently every other day, you do not remember it. The brain highlights failure because it feels important. This can lead to self-consciousness and avoidance, even when most people are not judging us. Negativity bias shapes how we view ourselves. After achieving several successes, one minor failure can make us feel like we are not good enough. We hold on to past mistakes and use them as proof of our limitations. Meanwhile, we dismiss our achievements as luck or not meaningful. Over time, this pattern lowers self-esteem and slows personal growth. We believe the negative stories our brain repeats even when they are exaggerated. At work, the bias influences leadership and team dynamics. A manager might focus on what an employee did wrong while ignoring consistent progress. This can demotivate the employee and create fear rather than improvement. Teams might spend more time preventing failure than pursuing innovation. When a group becomes overly focused on avoiding mistakes, creativity suffers. Negativity bias can make organizations risk-averse, even when growth requires experimentation. In relationships, negativity bias fuels arguments. If a partner forgets an important date, that moment might overshadow everything they do right. A single disagreement can feel bigger than months of harmony. People may say, "You always do this," when the negative moment is actually rare. The bias makes the negative seem frequent and intentional. It can also make apologies feel inadequate because the sting of the negative moment lasts longer than the soothing effect of the positive one. The bias affects how we consume media. News outlets know that negative stories get more attention. Disasters, scandals, and so on. And conflicts dominate headlines. Positive news rarely receives the same focus because it does not grab our attention as strongly. When we see negativity constantly, we start to believe the world is more dangerous or hopeless than it is. This fuels fear, anger, and division. In memory, negative events are stored with more sensory detail. You might vividly recall a time you were embarrassed, including the setting, sounds, and faces. But a pleasant day may blur into a general warm feeling without specifics. The intensity of the negative moment strengthens the memory. This can make moving on difficult, even when the event is long past. In decision-making, negativity bias makes us avoid loss more than we seek gain. If given a choice between winning something or avoiding a loss of the same value, most people work harder to avoid the loss. Losing $50 feels worse than gaining $50 feels good. This affects investments, career changes, and personal goals. People stay in jobs they dislike because the fear of failing elsewhere is stronger than the hope of success. They ignore opportunities because the small chance of something going wrong weighs more than the larger chance of improvement. Negativity bias influences how we talk to ourselves. When something goes wrong, we might say, "I always fail," or "I can't do anything right." We speak in extremes. If something goes well, we might say, "It wasn't a big deal," or "anyone could have done it." This pattern trains the brain to expect negativity. Over time, it becomes harder to see the positive, even when it is there. In parenthood, negativity bias can cause parents to worry constantly. One minor accident can make them feel like they are failing. They overlook all the times they protected, supported, and cared for their child. The bias magnifies guilt and fear. It can even lead to overprotection, reducing a child's chance to learn and grow. In friendships, negativity bias causes misunderstandings. If a friend cancels plans once, it can feel like rejection, even if they usually show support. We might focus on the one moment of disappointment instead of the many acts of loyalty. This can create resentment and distance. The relationship suffers because the negative moment carries more emotional weight than the positive history. Even our perception of the day can be skewed. You might wake up feeling fine, enjoy breakfast, have a productive morning, but then spill coffee in the afternoon. At night, when asked how your day was, you might say it was bad. The single negative event overshadows everything else. The brain gives more space to the negative in memory, shaping how we judge the entire day. This bias also affects how we view other people. If someone makes one mistake, we label them as careless or unreliable. We forget their many good actions. In group settings, one critical remark stands out more than several supportive ones. The negative voice becomes louder in our minds. This can shape reputations unfairly and harm trust. Negativity bias plays a role in mental health. It contributes to anxiety by focusing on threats. It feeds depression by highlighting failures and ignoring hope. The brain becomes trained to scan for danger, even when life is stable. Small setbacks feel overwhelming. Positive events feel temporary. This creates a cycle where negative thoughts reinforce negative emotions. Even when positive events are strong, they often need to be repeated to balance one negative moment. In relationships, psychologists suggest that it may take several positive interactions to make up for one negative one. The brain treats negative events as more important to remember and respond to. This is not because we enjoy negativity. It is because the mind wants to prevent harm. Negativity bias also influences how we plan for the future. We prepare for worst-case scenarios more than best-case ones. Preparation can be wise, but constant focus on what could go wrong can make us overly cautious. We might turn down opportunities, avoid new experiences, or withdraw from challenges because we imagine everything that might fail. The brain thinks it is protecting us, but it holds us back. Sometimes negativity bias keeps us stuck in the past. We replay painful memories instead of letting them fade. We hold on to criticism from years ago. We ignore compliments because they do not feel as real. The mind treats negativity as more believable. Even when someone tells us we did well, we look for hidden meaning or wait for criticism. Trusting the positive feels risky. On the other hand, the bias can help in certain situations. It keeps us alert to danger and helps us learn from mistakes. But when it dominates our thinking, it distorts reality. It turns minor setbacks into major problems and temporary issues into identity statements. We start to believe life is worse than it is. Understanding negativity bias helps us recognize when our mind is giving too much power to one bad moment. It reminds us to pause and notice what went right too. The world includes both pain and joy, both failure and success. The brain may focus on the negative first, but we can choose to look wider. Status quo bias makes us prefer things to stay the same, even when change might help us. The familiar feels safe, and the unknown feels risky. Our brain leans toward comfort because it sees change as a potential threat. This bias is not just about laziness. It is rooted in loss aversion. We fear losing what we already have more than we value what we might gain. Even if the current situation is not great, we stick with it because it feels predictable. The bias tells us, better the devil you know than the one you don't. Imagine someone stuck in a job they do not enjoy. They complain about stress and lack of growth, but when offered a new opportunity, they hesitate. They think, what if the new job is even worse? The uncertainty outweighs the potential benefits. The current job has routines and known expectations. The new one has unknown challenges. Status quo bias pushes them to stay where they are, even if leaving could improve their life. This bias also appears in small daily decisions. You might always order the same dish at your favorite restaurant. Even when you see something new that looks interesting, you avoid trying it. The risk of being disappointed feels worse than the possible excitement of discovering a new favorite. You choose familiarity over exploration. The decision feels safe, but it limits experience. Status quo bias shows up in finances. People keep money in low-interest accounts because it feels safe. Even if investing could give better returns, they think about what they might lose, not what they might gain. They avoid switching banks or insurance providers because the current system, while imperfect, is familiar. This leads to missed opportunities and long-term inefficiency. In relationships, the bias can keep people in unhealthy dynamics. Someone may stay in a friendship or partnership that drains them because starting over feels scary. They worry about being alone, finding someone new, or dealing with change. The fear of discomfort holds them in place. The status quo becomes the default, even when it hurts them. At the organizational level, status quo bias slows progress. Teams may resist new technology or processes because we've always done it this way, even when the current method is slow or outdated. People prefer it because they know how it works. Change means learning something new, making mistakes, and adjusting. The short-term discomfort overshadows the long-term advantage. Companies that fall into this bias fall behind more adaptable competitors. Governments and institutions experience this bias in policymaking. Leaders hesitate to implement reforms even when systems are broken. They worry about backlash or unintended consequences. Citizens may resist changes to laws or programs because they are used to how things work. Familiarity feels fair, even when it is inefficient or unjust. the bias can trap society in outdated structures. Status quo bias also affects personal habits. Someone who wants to get healthier might keep the same routine because change requires effort. They know exercising and eating better would help, but the comfort of current habits feels easier. They say, "I'll start tomorrow," but tomorrow keeps moving. The bias allows the present pattern to continue by default. The brain prefers the path of least resistance. This bias influences how we view identity. People often hold on to beliefs, even when new evidence shows those beliefs are outdated. Accepting change means admitting the old viewpoint may have been wrong. That threatens the sense of self. It is easier to stay with familiar beliefs than to rebuild mental frameworks. Status quo bias keeps worldviews intact, even when growth requires flexibility. In education, students may resist new learning methods. If they are used to memorizing facts, they might reject hands-on learning or group projects. Even if new methods improve understanding, they feel uncomfortable. Teachers face the same issue. They may stick to old lesson plans to avoid the work of redesigning material. Status quo bias protects tradition over innovation. The bias also shows up in voting. Voters often re-elect familiar candidates, even if they are unhappy with results. They worry a new leader could be worse. They choose the known option rather than the uncertain one. This can lead to stagnation in political systems. Change becomes rare, not because it is unnecessary, but because it feels risky. Status quo bias can make us ignore better deals. If you have had the same mobile plan or subscription for years, you might not bother comparing options. You assume switching is complicated or not worth the effort. Companies rely on this bias. They make renewal easy and change difficult. Even a small barrier is enough to keep people where they are. In group settings, the bias grows stronger. If everyone around you is comfortable with the current situation, you might not speak up. Suggesting change can feel like causing trouble. You fear judgment or rejection. The group protects the status quo, and individuals stay silent. This prevents creative solutions and improvement. Fear of regret also fuels the bias. If you change something and it goes wrong, you might blame yourself. If you stay the same and things stay bad, you can shrug and say, "That's just how it is." Keeping the status quo protects you from feeling responsible. This fear of regret keeps people stuck in patterns they do not like. Status quo bias can be subtle. Sometimes we do not even make decisions. We let things continue automatically. For example, we allow subscriptions to renew, routines to persist, and relationships to drift. Inaction becomes a decision, but we do not think of it that way. The bias makes default choices seem neutral, even when they have consequences. Imagine a town deciding whether to build a new park. The current empty lot is unused and unattractive. A park would improve health and community life. But some residents say it is risky or too much work. They worry about cost or maintenance. They forget the current empty lot also has costs. They protect the status quo because it feels easier. Progress stalls. Status quo bias can also appear in emotional healing. Someone who has been hurt in the past might cling to their pain because it is familiar. Healing means facing new feelings and letting go of old narratives. That process feels uncertain. The bias protects emotional habits even when they cause suffering. Even technology choices reflect this bias. People keep using outdated devices or software because learning a new system takes effort. They prefer small frustrations over the temporary discomfort of change. This slows adaptation and limits efficiency. Eventually, they may be forced to upgrade when the old option stops working, but by then, they have fallen behind. In creative work, The bias blocks experimentation. An artist might repeat the same style because it is safe. A writer might follow the same structure because it works. Trying a new approach feels risky. The brain warns against change, even when innovation could lead to growth. The bias keeps creativity in a box. Status quo bias shapes how people view time. They think things are fine for now, without considering long-term effects. A habit that seems harmless today may build into a problem tomorrow. But because the present feels comfortable, they avoid change. This short-term focus hides future consequences. Even when someone wants change, the bias can slow them. They may gather information, make plans, and talk about change, but hesitate to act. The moment of decision feels heavy. The brain creates doubts. What if this is a mistake? Or what if I lose what I have? These thoughts protect the status quo. The current situation, even if unsatisfying, feels safer than the unknown. To see how strong this bias is, consider how companies design forms. When the default option is set to yes, most people say yes. When a default is no, most people say no. People stick with the default, even when making an active choice would benefit them. The status quo becomes the silent decision maker. Status quo bias is powerful because it hides behind comfort. It makes inaction feel smart, safe, and reasonable. It tells us change is risky, even when change is the path to improvement. Recognizing this bias helps us question whether we are choosing stability for good reasons or simply because it is familiar. When we pause and challenge the default, we create space for better choices. The sunk cost fallacy keeps us holding on to things we've invested in, even when it's better to let go. It happens because our brain does not want to waste what we have already spent: time, money, effort, or emotional energy. Once we commit to something, we feel pressure to stick with it to justify the investment. We ignore the fact that the past cost cannot be recovered. The only question that truly matters is whether continuing will help us or hurt us in the future. But instead of thinking forward, we look backward and let our past choices trap us. Imagine you buy expensive concert tickets. On the day of the event, you feel sick and we'd rather stay home. You know going will make you uncomfortable, yet you force yourself to attend because you paid for it. The money is already gone, but you treat attending as a way to avoid wasting it. In reality, you sacrifice your comfort to protect a cost you cannot get back. That is the sunk cost fallacy in its simplest form. This bias appears in bigger decisions too. Someone might stay in a college major they do not enjoy because they already completed 2 years of coursework. They worry switching majors would mean the first 2 years were wasted. But staying in the wrong major wastes even more time and energy. The longer they hold on, the harder it becomes to change. The investment becomes a chain. In relationships, sunk cost fallacy can keep people stuck. A person may stay with a partner even when they are unhappy because they have been together for years. They think about the memories, the shared experiences, and the efforts already made. They say, "I can't leave after everything we've been through." But the past does not guarantee a better future. If the relationship continues to cause pain, staying only adds more loss. The same applies to friendships, business partnerships, and family dynamics. The longer the history, the stronger the trap. At work, people often stick with failing projects. A team might pour money and time into an idea that is not working. When problems appear, they double down instead of stepping back. They say, "We've already invested too much to stop now." They fear looking foolish. They hope more effort will turn it around. This mindset leads to what people call throwing good money after bad. Companies waste resources trying to save something that cannot be saved. Meanwhile, better opportunities are ignored. The fallacy also appears in careers. Someone might stay in a job they dislike because they spent years climbing the ladder. They feel they earned their position and believe leaving would mean starting over. They tell themselves they have come too far to walk away. But staying in the wrong place can drain motivation and limit growth. Instead of asking, "What have I put in?" the better question is, "What will I get out if I keep going?" Even small decisions reflect this bias. You start reading a book that you do not enjoy. Rather than stop, you force yourself to finish because you already read half. The time you spent reading cannot be regained. Yet you choose to spend more time being bored instead of moving on to something better. People do this with TV shows, hobbies, even meals. They keep eating food they dislike because they paid for it. The fallacy turns a one-time loss into ongoing discomfort. In sports, coaches sometimes keep star players on the field, even when they are underperforming. They paid a high salary or traded valuable assets to get them. Benching the player feels like admitting a mistake, so they keep playing them, hoping the investment eventually pays off. But the team suffers when decisions are driven by past expenses instead of current performance. Governments fall into this trap on a larger scale. When money is spent on big projects, leaders hesitate to cancel them, even when the project proves inefficient. They worry the public will accuse them of wasting money, so they continue funding it to finish what we started. The result is more waste. The past cost becomes the excuse to create more loss. The sunk cost fallacy also affects emotions. Someone might remain loyal to a personal goal that no longer fits who they are. Maybe they dreamed of becoming something when they were younger. As they grow, the dream does not match their interests, but they cling to it because they already invested so much into it. They feel quitting means failure, but letting go can open the door to something better. The fallacy turns identity into a trap. Why do we fall for this? Part of it is pride. We do not want to admit we made a bad choice. Changing direction feels like failure, so we keep going to protect our ego. Another reason is fear of judgment. We weigh others will think we gave up. We prefer to continue suffering rather than face criticism. Some people also confuse commitment with wisdom. They believe quitting means weakness, even when quitting is the smartest move. Loss aversion plays a large role. Our brains hate losing more than they enjoy winning. The idea of wasting past effort feels painful. So we try to recover the loss by pushing forward, hoping to turn it into a win. But continuing for the sake of the past blinds us to the future. The cost we fear wasting has already been spent. Consider a couple renovating a house. They spend thousands fixing one problem after another. Each repair reveals new issues. The house becomes a money pit. Instead of stopping, they keep pouring in cash because they already spent so much. They tell themselves they are close to finishing. In truth, they feel trapped by prior investments. The fallacy makes them ignore the option of selling and moving on. It can also influence how we view relationships with time itself. If someone has spent years learning a skill they no longer enjoy, they might feel obligated to continue using it. They think, "I can't waste my training," but continuing with something that drains you is also wasteful. Better to redirect that energy into something meaningful than cling to something just because it took time to learn. Even when the future looks clearly worse than the alternative, sunk cost fallacy convinces us to stay the course. Think of a gambler who loses money at a casino. Instead of walking away, they keep betting to try to win it back. They spiral deeper into loss. They are not making rational decisions. They are trying to erase the past. This bias can make people defend outdated beliefs. If someone spends years promoting a certain idea, Accepting new evidence against it feels like invalidating their past. They double down instead of adapting. The investment in the belief becomes more important than the truth. The fallacy turns the past into a burden. To see how strong the effect is, imagine buying a movie ticket. During the movie, you realize it is terrible. The logical choice is to leave, but people stay because they paid for the ticket. They suffer through something they do not enjoy to get their money's worth. But the only thing they get is more wasted time. The ticket is already spent whether they stay or leave. The future is the only thing left to control. The sunk cost fallacy thrives when we are tired, overwhelmed, or emotionally attached. It disguises itself as loyalty, persistence, or responsibility. But true responsibility involves making choices based on future value, not past expense. Letting go is not failure. It is strategy. It frees us to use our time, energy, and resources in better ways. The past is fixed, but the future is still open. When we stop chasing what cannot be recovered, we create space for something better. Self-serving bias makes us credit ourselves for success and blame others for failure. It works quietly in the background to protect our self-esteem. When things go well, we say it is because we are talented, smart, or hardworking. When things go wrong, we point to bad luck, unfair treatment, or someone else's mistake. This bias keeps our self-image positive, but it also distorts reality. It stops us from seeing our role in problems and makes it harder to learn from experience. Imagine taking a test. If you score high, you tell yourself you studied well or you are naturally good at the subject. If you score low, you say the questions were unclear or the teacher did not prepare you. The outcome stays tied to ego. Success feels earned, failure feels external. Even when both results involve a mix of effort and circumstance, the bias simplifies it in our favor. This bias shows up at work. If a project goes well, someone might say their leadership or creativity made it succeed. If it fails, they might say the team did not listen, the client changed direction, or the deadline was impossible. They protect their reputation in their own mind. Over time, this blocks growth. If we only take credit and never take responsibility, we stop improving. The bias also shapes how we view everyday events. Suppose you arrive early to a meeting. You think, "I am organized." If you are late, you say traffic was bad or something unexpected came up. When others are late, you think they are careless. We treat our own actions differently than others' actions. The bias bends our judgment to protect our image while judging others more harshly. In relationships, self-serving bias causes conflict. In an argument, each person thinks they are the reasonable one and the other person is the problem. If the relationship is going well, someone may credit their patience or kindness. If it falls apart, they blame the partner. This stops honest reflection. It also prevents apology. When both people use self-serving bias, neither takes responsibility. The argument becomes about proving blame rather than solving the issue. In sports, athletes often say they won because of skill and lost because of officiating or weather. Coaches do it too. When a team wins, the plan was brilliant. When they lose, players did not execute. Fans join in. They protect their pride by finding external excuses. This bias fuels emotional reactions and stops people from seeing the full picture. The bias also affects how we react to feedback. When someone praises us, we accept it quickly. When someone criticizes us, we push back or find excuses. We say the feedback is unfair or the person does not understand. This makes it hard to hear the truth. Growth often comes from understanding our weaknesses, but self-serving bias tells us to ignore them. People often use this bias when comparing themselves to others. If we see someone succeed, we might say they had connections or luck. If we succeed, we say we earned it. This helps us maintain a sense of superiority. It fuels jealousy and judgment. When we see someone struggle, we may say they are lazy or unskilled. If we struggle, we say the situation was unfair. We bend reality to protect our self-worth. Self-serving bias also appears in group settings. If a team wins an award, everyone wants to claim responsibility. If the team fails, everyone wants to distance themselves. People highlight their contributions and hide their mistakes. This destroys trust. It creates competition instead of cooperation. Teams that fall into this pattern struggle to improve because they focus on defending their image rather than working together. In education, students may blame teachers for poor grades, but credit themselves for good ones. They say, "I worked hard," when they earn praise, but the test was too hard when they fall short. This mindset harms progress. It encourages selective responsibility. It can also lead to entitlement, where students expect praise without effort. Self-serving bias affects leadership as well. A leader may take credit for success and blame employees for failure. This damages morale. When leaders refuse responsibility, their teams lose respect. A good leader acknowledges their role in mistakes and learns from them. But the bias tempts leaders to protect their ego instead of facing flaws. Over time, this creates a culture where people fear blame and hide problems. The bias can even shape how we remember the past. We recall events in a way that supports our self-image. If we recall a time we succeeded, we remember our effort. If we recall a time we failed, we remember the obstacles. The brain edits our memories to keep us feeling competent. This distorted memory makes us more convinced our version of events is correct. It also makes it harder to see patterns in our behavior. Self-serving bias ties closely to identity. We want to believe we are capable and good. When something threatens that belief, we deflect the blame. This protects us emotionally, but it limits growth. If we never accept our role in failure, we repeat the same mistakes. Personal development requires honest self-assessment, but this bias blocks it. This bias also affects moral judgment. If we break a rule, we say we had a good reason. If someone else breaks the same rule, we say they lack character. We excuse our own actions but condemn others. This double standard damages relationships and societal trust. It also fuels hypocrisy. Even luck gets twisted by this bias. When something good happens, we downplay the role of luck and emphasize our skill. When something bad happens, we highlight the role of luck. This keeps our ego intact, but it misrepresents reality. Success often involves both effort and opportunity. Failure often involves both mistakes and circumstances. Recognizing this balance leads to humility. Self-serving bias hides it. In parenting, self-serving bias can affect how parents view their children's behavior. If a child behaves well, the parent says it is because of good parenting. If the child misbehaves, the parent blames peers or media. This prevents parents from reflecting on their own actions. It can also create unfair pressure on children to maintain the parent's image. Self-serving bias influences how we judge outcomes. If a risky decision works, we say we were bold and smart. If it fails, we say the odds were against us. This bias encourages risky behavior because we assume credit if it goes well and dismiss responsibility if it fails. It blocks accurate evaluation of choices. The bias also appears in cultural and national identity. A country may take credit for victories in history and blame others for failures. This creates one-sided narratives. It feeds pride but hides mistakes. Honest reflection becomes difficult. The same happens with political parties, fan bases, and social groups. Group identity mixes with self-serving bias to defend beliefs and actions even when they are flawed. Self-serving bias even affects how we teach others. If we give someone advice and they succeed, we believe we helped them. If they fail, we say they did not follow instructions. We protect our sense of being wise or helpful, rather than considering whether our advice was unclear or unhelpful. This bias can harm mental health. If we take credit only for success, we tie our worth to achievement. When failure eventually happens, blaming others may protect self-esteem in the moment, but it prevents healing. Accepting responsibility can feel painful, but it leads to growth. Self-serving bias keeps people stuck in the same cycles. To overcome this bias, we need honesty and humility. It does not mean taking blame for everything. It means recognizing our role accurately. When we succeed, we can feel proud, but still acknowledge the help we received or the luck involved. When we fail, we can look at what we could have done differently. This mindset does not weaken us, it strengthens us. It builds resilience and maturity. Self-serving bias may protect our ego, but balanced thinking protects our future. Optimism bias gently convinces us that things will work out, even without evidence. It is the quiet voice that says, "It will be fine," even when the facts point in another direction. At first, it seems harmless or even helpful. Hope can keep us motivated. Confidence can push us forward. But optimism bias goes beyond healthy hope. It makes us underestimate danger, ignore warning signs, and assume success is guaranteed. It blinds us to preparation and lures us into complacency. Imagine someone starting a new business. They believe it will succeed because they are passionate and hardworking. They picture loyal customers and steady income. They tell themselves most businesses struggle because others did not try as hard. But they ignore statistics showing many startups fail due to cash flow, competition, or timing. Their optimism blocks them from planning for setbacks. When challenges appear, they feel shocked. Optimism bias gave them confidence but not readiness. This bias shows up in finances. People spend money assuming future income will cover it. They take on debt expecting promotions, bonuses, or luck. They believe emergencies will not happen to them. They do not save because they think problems only happen to other people. When something unexpected happens, a job loss, a medical bill, they feel blindsided. The optimism bias made danger feel distant, even though risk was always present. In health, optimism bias can be risky. People believe they are less likely to get sick than others. They skip checkups, ignore symptoms, or maintain unhealthy habits because they assume their body will handle it. Smokers think cancer happens to other smokers. Drivers think accidents happen to careless people, not them. This bias gives a false sense of immunity. It makes us feel special in the wrong way. In relationships, the bias shows up as blind confidence. Someone might overlook serious issues, assuming love will fix everything. They ignore communication problems, financial stress, or emotional distance. They believe things will improve without taking action. Optimism bias masks warning signs until the problems become too big. By the time reality hits, the damage is harder to repair. Students experience this bias when preparing for exams. They tell themselves, "I'll be fine," even when they have not studied. They think they will remember the material or that the test will be easy. Their confidence leads to procrastination. When the test is harder than expected, they are surprised. Optimism bias turned hope into avoidance. In the workplace, optimism bias can affect teams. A manager might assume a project will finish on time without accounting for obstacles. They set unrealistic deadlines, believing things will go smoothly. They ignore previous delays because this time will be different. The team then rushes, cuts corners, and burns out. When the project falls behind, the manager blames external issues. The real problem was ignoring risk because of optimism. Even experts fall for this bias. Economists predict growth without considering downturns. Engineers believe their design will work perfectly on the first try. Doctors assume treatments will go as planned. Confidence is useful, but overconfidence blocks careful planning. Optimism bias hides complexity. This bias also shows up in everyday decisions. Someone might move to a new city with no savings, believing everything will fall into place. They think they will find a job fast or make friends easily. When reality proves harder, they feel discouraged. The issue was not the move. It was the assumption that success was guaranteed. Optimism bias can feel comforting. It reduces fear and boosts motivation. But it also leads to poor risk assessment. We downplay the likelihood of negative outcomes. We think heartbreak, accidents, failure, or loss are things that happen to other people. We treat ourselves as the exception. When we do this, we make choices without safety nets. This bias affects how we set goals. We underestimate how long tasks take. We assume we will have more energy, focus, or luck in the future. We plan based on best-case scenarios. When reality does not match, we fall behind or give up. Optimism bias inflates expectations and then crushes us with disappointment. In group settings, optimism bias can spread quickly. One confident voice can convince everyone the plan is solid. Doubts are silenced to maintain positive energy. The group overlooks challenges to stay supportive. This leads to groupthink, where enthusiasm replaces critical thinking. When problems arise, no one was prepared because everyone assumed success was certain. Optimism bias can even affect memory. After things work out, we tell ourselves we always knew it would. We forget the uncertainty we felt earlier. This false clarity makes us even more confident the next time. We stop questioning risk and start assuming good outcomes are normal. The bias builds on itself. On the other hand, optimism bias can sometimes help us keep going. If we knew every obstacle in advance, we might never start difficult things. Hope can fuel persistence. But there is a difference between strategic optimism and blind optimism. Strategic optimism sees the goal clearly, but also prepares for setbacks. Blind optimism ignores the obstacles entirely. The bias pushes us toward the blind version. Consider someone training for a marathon. A realistic optimist says, "I can do this, but I need a training plan." Optimism bias says, "I'll be fine," and skips preparation. When race day comes, the untrained runner struggles. The belief alone was not enough. Optimism without action turns into pain. This bias also affects how we think about the future in general. Most people believe their future will be better than their past, even if they do nothing to change their habits. They expect more happiness, more success, better health, better relationships. This belief can inspire hope, but it can also create laziness. When we expect improvement without effort, we stay stuck. Optimism bias influences how people respond to warnings. When experts talk about climate change, debt crises, or health risks, many people dismiss them. They think society will figure it out or technology will solve it. They assume someone will handle it. The bias shifts responsibility away from ourselves. It delays action until the problem becomes urgent. In parenting, optimism bias may lead parents to believe their child is safe from dangers that affect other children. They think their child will not get involved in risky behavior or struggle with mental health. This assumption can lead to missed warning signs. Optimism blinds them to reality until the issue becomes severe. Optimism bias shows up in aging. People believe they will stay healthy longer than average. They assume they will remain independent and sharp. When decline happens, they feel unprepared. They never planned for aging because they trusted things would work out. The bias turned hope into denial. Even with time management, optimism bias causes trouble. We think this will only take a minute, and it takes an hour. We stack too many tasks into a day. We believe future us will be more productive than present us. We overcommit, then we fall behind and feel overwhelmed. The bias makes us generous with promises, but stingy with reality. This bias can make us take emotional risks without caution. Someone might rush into a relationship believing it will solve their problems. They ignore red flags because they feel hopeful. When things collapse, they are shocked. Optimism bias made them see only the good. At the core, optimism bias tells us that negative outcomes apply to others and positive outcomes apply to us. It feeds our desire to feel safe and special. But when we rely on hope without preparation, we set ourselves up for preventable pain. The bias does not warn us when danger is close. It whispers, "Don't worry." And when we listen too closely, we stop asking the most important question: what if things don't go as planned? Pessimism bias does the opposite, expecting the worst to feel safe. It builds a mental shield that says, if I assume things will go wrong, I won't be disappointed. At first, it seems like a form of protection. If you lower expectations, you avoid the pain of being let down. But pessimism bias goes beyond caution. It makes negative outcomes feel more likely than they are. It convinces you that failure is the default and success is rare. It turns uncertainty into assumed disaster. It feels like realism, but it quietly distorts the truth. Imagine someone applying for a job they are qualified for. Before the interview, they think, they probably won't hire me. They picture the rejection. They talk themselves out of confidence. They hold back in the interview because they already expect to lose. When they do not get the job, they say, "See, I knew it." The bias confirms itself. But the problem was not fate. It was their mindset shaping their behavior. Pessimism did not protect them. It sabotaged them. This bias shows up in relationships. Someone might believe people always leave or disappoint. They assume the relationship will fail sooner or later. Because of this, they hold back emotionally. They avoid vulnerability. They test their partner or push them away. Their behavior, driven by fear, creates the very problems they expected. The pessimism feels like wisdom, but it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. In daily life, pessimism bias makes small problems feel huge. If someone makes one mistake at work, they might think, "My boss probably hates me," or "I'm going to get fired." They jump to the worst-case scenario instead of seeing the situation in context. This drains energy and increases stress. The brain becomes trained to scan for danger, even when danger is not present. Pessimism bias often hides behind phrases like, "I'm just being realistic." But realism means looking at all possibilities. Pessimism focuses only on the negative. It ignores evidence of success, hope, or progress. A person with this bias might achieve something good, then immediately say, "It won't last." They cannot enjoy wins because they are already waiting for things to fall apart. This mindset steals satisfaction from the present and hope from the future. In planning, pessimism bias leads to avoidance. If someone believes a project will fail, they might not start it at all. They think, "Why try if it won't work?" They miss opportunities because they assume effort is pointless. Their fear of failure keeps them stuck in the same place. They call it protection, but it is actually paralysis. In health, pessimism bias can weaken the body. Studies show people who constantly expect bad outcomes have higher stress levels. Stress affects sleep, immunity, and overall well-being. Someone might think, "I'll probably get sick anyway," and then neglect habits that could help. They give up before they begin. This mindset can even affect recovery. Patients who believe they won't improve often heal more slowly. In finances, pessimism bias can be just as harmful as reckless optimism. Someone might refuse to invest or pursue career growth because they fear loss. They hoard resources instead of using them wisely. They turn down promotions or business ideas because in their mind, failure is certain. They feel safe, but their fear blocks potential success. Over time, staying still becomes the greatest risk. Pessimism bias also impacts creativity. A writer might think, "No one will like my ideas." An artist might say, "Why bother?" A musician might stop playing because they assume they are not good enough. The bias kills ideas before they are tested. It convinces people to silence themselves. Innovation dies in the shadow of imagined rejection. Even memory is shaped by this bias. When people look back, they remember the hardships more clearly than the successes. They retell their past as a series of struggles, even if there were many positive moments. The brain edits the story to support the belief that life is mostly difficult. This version of the past influences how they see the future. They expect more of what they remember, and if they only remember pain, they prepare for pain. In social situations, pessimism bias causes withdrawal. Someone might assume others are judging them or will reject them. They avoid conversations, events, or connection. They think isolation is safer. But isolation increases loneliness and insecurity. The bias creates the very discomfort it tries to avoid. Pessimism bias often emerges from past hurt. If someone has been betrayed, failed, or embarrassed, the brain tries to prevent that pain from happening again. It learns to expect the worst because expecting the best once led to disappointment. But instead of protecting, this mindset places old wounds in every new situation. It treats the future as a continuation of the past. Growth becomes difficult because fear controls judgment. In teamwork, pessimism bias can drag everyone down. One person constantly pointing out what could go wrong can shut down motivation. Caution is useful when it guides solutions, but pessimism only predicts failure without offering improvement. It stops action instead of guiding it. Leaders can also fall into this bias. A leader who expects failure might avoid bold moves. They might say no to innovation to avoid risk. The team becomes stagnant. Employees feel stuck because every idea is met with doubt or negativity. A leader believes they are protecting the organization, but in reality, they are holding it back. The bias can even affect how people receive good news. Someone might get a compliment and say, "They're just being nice." They might get a promotion and think, "They'll regret this." They cannot accept positive outcomes as real. They question everything good and trust everything bad. This mindset steals joy and builds constant tension. Even when people with pessimism bias are right about potential problems, they often underestimate their ability to handle them. They see danger, but not their own strength. They forget past situations where they overcame difficulty. They see only what could go wrong, not how they could respond. This makes challenges feel bigger than they are. Pessimism bias also affects how people set expectations for others. A parent might assume a child will fail and, trying to protect them, discourage them from trying new things. This lowers the child's confidence. The bias then appears in the next generation. Fear becomes a family habit. In decision-making, pessimism bias often disguises itself as wisdom. People say, "Hope for the best, but expect the worst." But someone deep in this bias does not hope for the best. They only expect the worst. They think disappointment is safer than hope. But avoiding hope does not prevent pain, it prevents progress. This bias can create a false sense of control. People feel safer when they prepare for disaster. They believe expecting the worst means they won't be surprised, but constant negative thinking does not stop bad things from happening. It only guarantees suffering before they happen, sometimes when they never happen at all. Pessimism bias also damages resilience. When people believe bad outcomes are inevitable, they stop trying to recover. If they face a setback, they say, "This always happens," and give up. Optimists recover faster because they believe improvement is possible. Pessimists stay stuck because they believe change is pointless. One of the most harmful parts of this bias is how rational it feels. Pessimistic thoughts often sound intelligent or cautious. They are rarely loud or dramatic. They say things like, "Be realistic," "Don't get your hopes up," or "It probably won't work." These statements feel safe, but when used constantly, they become walls that block opportunity. The bias also creates unequal judgment. If something bad happens, pessimistic people say, "That's typical." If something good happens, they say, "That won't last." They do not allow evidence to change their outlook. They treat negative outcomes as truth and positive outcomes as accidents. The mind becomes biased against hope. Pessimism bias drains life of curiosity. It tells us not to explore, not to trust, not to dream. It flashes the worst-case scenario in every decision. But life is not made of only losses. There are risks worth taking. There are problems we can solve. There are challenges we can handle. Expecting the worst may feel safe, but it often keeps us from ever finding out what could go right. In-group bias makes us favor people who are similar to us. It is a natural impulse rooted in how humans survived in the past. Belonging to a group offered safety, trust, and cooperation. Our brains still use this instinct. We divide the world into us and them, often without realizing it. When someone feels familiar because of background, beliefs, culture, appearance, or even hobbies, we feel more comfortable with them. We assume they are trustworthy. We give them the benefit of the doubt. At the same time, we may treat people outside our group with caution or indifference, even when they have done nothing wrong. Imagine working in an office where most people share the same hometown or went to similar schools. When a new employee joins from a different city or culture, the in-group members might include each other in conversations, inside jokes, or informal meetings. They don't do it to be cruel. It just feels natural, but the new person feels left out. In-group bias creates invisible barriers. It shapes who gets information, support, and opportunities, often without any intent to exclude. This bias appears early in life. Children often choose friends who look or act like them. They defend their group during games and reject others. As adults, the behavior becomes more subtle, but it remains. People bond over shared language, interests, religion, or politics. These bonds feel positive, but they also strengthen division. When we only trust or elevate our own group, we shut out diverse ideas and limit growth. In-group bias also affects hiring. A manager might prefer a candidate who reminds them of themselves. They may say the person feels like a good fit, which often means "sits my group." This can happen even when another candidate is more qualified. Over time, teams become less diverse and more uniform. The company loses creativity and perspective because everyone thinks the same way. In-group bias feels like fairness, but it often leads to unfair outcomes. This bias also shapes how we interpret behavior. If someone from our group makes a mistake, we excuse it. We say they were tired or stressed. If someone from outside the group makes the same mistake, we call them careless or incapable. We apply double standards without noticing. We protect us and judge them. This creates tension and misunderstanding. People outside the group sense the bias and feel disrespected. In-group bias can even influence memory. We remember the good actions of our group and forget the bad. We remember the bad actions of outsiders and forget the good. Our memory filters events to protect group identity. This leads to stereotypes. We think our group is kind, skilled, or reasonable. We think other groups are difficult, lazy, or wrong. The bias strengthens these beliefs over time, even when they are not true. At a larger scale, in-group bias fuels conflict. Political parties treat their own members as patriotic and smart, while viewing the other side as dangerous or ignorant. Sports fans defend their team no matter what, and insult rival fans. Nations glorify their history and ignore their mistakes while criticizing others. Each group believes they are the good guys. The bias blinds them to their own flaws. In everyday situations, in-group bias decides who gets our empathy. If someone in our group struggles, we care. If someone outside our group struggles, we might ignore it. The bias controls how much compassion we give. We see our people as individuals with stories. We see outsiders as categories. When we personalize one group and generalize another, it becomes easy to justify unfair treatment. Even small and random labels can create in-group bias. In experiments, people are divided into arbitrary groups, like Team Blue and Team Green. With no history or meaningful difference, people still favor their own team. They give them more rewards and judge them more positively. This shows how automatic the bias is. We do not need a deep reason to form an us. The mind creates it quickly. At work, in-group bias affects feedback. A supervisor may give constructive support to someone they relate to, but give harsh criticism to someone outside the group. The difference is tone. One person gets guidance, the other gets blame. Over time, the favored employee grows, while the excluded one loses confidence. Bias shapes careers in quiet ways. In-group bias can also influence collaboration. If team members only listen to people in their circle, the best ideas may never be heard. Decisions may lean toward comfort rather than quality. Group members may resist suggestions from outsiders, even when those suggestions are valuable. The bias turns protectiveness into stubbornness. Sometimes in-group bias feels warm and positive. People in the group help each other and build strong bonds. But if that support is limited only to the group, fairness disappears. Others are left behind. In families, parents might unconsciously favor one child because they share traits or interests. That child gets more attention or freedom. The other child notices but cannot explain why. In-group bias creates unspoken favoritism. The bias also appears in how we trust information. We believe news or opinions from people who think like us. We doubt or reject facts from outsiders. Even when the outsider is more knowledgeable, we still prefer the familiar voice. This weakens judgment. We become loyal to our group's beliefs rather than loyal to the truth. In-group bias often hides in small choices: who we invite to lunch, who we include in group chats, who we ask for advice, who we defend in conflicts. These choices add up. They shape relationships, opportunities, and culture. When we unconsciously favor people like us, we create inequality. The bias also affects how we define similar. It does not always mean appearance or background. It can be personality, values, income level, or even taste in music. Two people may look different, but still see each other as in-group because they share humor or goals. Meanwhile, Someone who looks the same but thinks differently might be treated as an outsider. In-group bias is not always visible. It lives in perception. It can also appear in silence. If someone from our group behaves badly, we may ignore it to protect them. If someone from outside does the same, we call it out. This protects the in-group's image but harms fairness. It also prevents growth. Calling out our own group is harder but more honest. Sometimes the bias becomes defensive. When outsiders succeed, the in-group might feel threatened. They may downplay the success or find flaws. They may create rules or barriers to keep outsiders from joining. This protects the group's status but deepens division. People experiencing in-group bias from the outside can feel invisible. They may feel like they must work twice as hard to earn the trust others get for free. They may stop trying to belong because the group already decided who belongs. This leads to resentment and disengagement. In-group bias is not always loud or hateful. Often, it is quiet, comfortable, and unnoticed. That is what makes it powerful. It shapes decisions without appearing in our reasoning. We think we are being fair when we are really being loyal to similarity. The mind chooses safety over openness. Understanding this bias does not mean we must reject our groups. Connection is natural and healthy. The goal is to widen who we consider us. When we see individuals instead of categories, we break the pattern. When we give others the same benefit of the doubt we give our in-group, we grow. In-group bias feels like trust and loyalty, but when it blinds us to fairness, it limits what we see and who we connect with. The halo effect causes one good trait to overshadow flaws. When we notice something positive about a person, product, or idea, our mind uses that one detail to make assumptions about everything else. If someone is attractive, confident, or skilled in one area, we assume they are also intelligent, trustworthy, and kind, even without evidence. This shortcut feels natural because the brain likes consistency. Tries to simplify judgment by turning one strength into a complete picture. But this can lead us to ignore important information and make biased decisions without realizing it. Imagine meeting someone who speaks well and dresses professionally. They make a strong first impression. Without thinking, you might assume they are competent and reliable. You trust their opinions even before seeing their work. Later, even if they make mistakes, you excuse them. The initial positive trait, good presentation, creates a halo that protects them from criticism. Someone else with the same mistakes might not get the same grace if they did not make that strong first impression. The halo effect appears very often with celebrities. If an actor is charming on screen, people assume they are kind or smart in real life. They may trust their opinions on topics outside their expertise. Companies use this bias in advertising. A famous athlete promotes a product unrelated to sports, and people buy it because they associate the athlete's success with the product's quality. The product may be average, but the halo of the celebrity makes it seem superior. In the workplace, the halo effect can shape careers. A manager may favor an employee who impressed them early. If the employee did one project well, the manager assumes they are strong in all areas. That employee gets more opportunities, while others who perform just as well are overlooked. This creates unfair advantages. It also prevents managers from seeing growth areas. The favored employee may struggle in some tasks, but the halo hides those weaknesses. The opposite also happens, the horn effect. One negative trait causes us to view everything about a person as bad. But the halo effect is more subtle because positive impressions feel pleasant. We do not notice when we are being overly generous with our judgment. Teachers fall into this bias with students. A student who answers confidently or behaves politely may be assumed to be smarter than they are. Their mistakes are seen as accidental. A quieter student who performs just as well might not receive the same praise. The teacher does not do this on purpose. The halo effect influences how effort and ability are perceived. In relationships, the halo effect can lead to unrealistic expectations. When someone is charming or caring in one situation, we assume they will always act that way. We overlook early signs of incompatibility. We explain away flaws because we want the positive trait to represent the whole person. This can lead to disappointment later when the idealized image does not match reality. Love can intensify the halo effect, making it harder to see people as they truly are. This bias also affects how we judge ourselves. If we succeed in one area, we might assume we are good at everything. For example, someone who is successful at work might believe they are automatically a great leader or great with people. They may ignore feedback because the positive identity creates a halo over their weaknesses. The bias inflates ego and slows personal growth. The halo effect impacts hiring decisions. Interviewers often decide within the first few minutes if they like a candidate. If the candidate is confident, well-spoken, or shares similar interests, the interviewer assumes they are qualified, even before reviewing their skills in depth. This can lead to hiring based on chemistry rather than competence. It also causes interviewers to overlook stronger candidates who are less charismatic. The bias is common in customer experiences. If a company has strong branding or attractive packaging, customers assume the product is high quality. They might ignore flaws or minor issues because the brand feels trustworthy. The first positive impression influences all later judgments. Companies spend large amounts of money on image because they know the halo effect can create loyalty, even when the product itself is average. The halo effect also appears in leadership. Charismatic leaders gain trust quickly. People follow their ideas, even when those ideas lack evidence. The leader's confidence becomes the anchor, and followers assume everything they say is wise. This can be dangerous in high-stakes situations like politics or business, where decisions require careful thinking. A polished speech can overshadow poor logic. The bias can even affect safety. A doctor with a friendly bedside manner may be trusted completely, and patients may not question their treatment plans. If the doctor misses something, the patient may hesitate to ask for a second opinion. The halo effect makes it harder to see potential errors. In contrast, a less warned doctor might be doubted even when they are highly skilled. The halo effect is powerful because it happens automatically. The brain uses first impressions to save energy. Instead of analyzing each trait separately, it creates a global judgment. It fills in gaps with assumptions, often based on emotion rather than fact. This reduces uncertainty, but it also reduces accuracy. The bias can also appear in reverse situations. If someone we admire does something wrong, we make excuses. We say they were tired or misunderstood. We protect the positive image. But if someone we do not like does the same thing, we judge them harshly. This double standard comes from the halo effect blended with personal preference. Even one small detail can trigger the bias. A clean workspace might make someone seem more organized across the board. A strong handshake might make someone seem confident and capable. A pleasant voice might make someone seem intelligent. These traits have nothing to do with overall ability, but the brain connects them anyway. The halo effect makes feedback difficult. If someone is highly liked, others hesitate to point out mistakes. They fear damaging the positive image or appearing critical. This blocks growth. The person continues believing they are stronger in all areas than they truly are. Honest feedback disappears behind the glow of the halo. In group settings, the halo effect influences whose ideas get heard. If one person is seen as the star, their suggestions are accepted with little questioning. Another person might share the same idea and get ignored. The group believes they are being fair, but they are following the halo. This creates an imbalance of voice and shuts down collaboration. Over time, the halo effect can create illusions of competence. Someone may build a reputation based on one success, then ride that reputation for years. People trust them without checking if their current work is as strong. The halo becomes a long-term advantage, even when performance declines. The bias also affects judgment of morality. If someone has a strong reputation for kindness or generosity, people may refuse to believe they could act unethically. When evidence appears, people defend them or deny it. The halo effect protects them from accountability. This can allow harmful behavior to continue unchecked. The halo effect does not only apply to people. We apply it to brands, schools, companies, and even cities. If a company is known for one excellent product, we assume all their products are high quality. If a school is prestigious, we assume all its students are exceptional. These assumptions simplify thinking but distort facts. The bias can be reduced by slowing down judgment. Instead of asking, "Do I like this person?" we can ask, "What evidence do I have for each trait?" Seeing people as complex rather than consistent breaks the halo. Strength in one area does not equal strength in all areas. Weakness in one area does not erase their strengths. The halo effect feels natural because it tells a simple story. The truth is usually more detailed. The horn effect is the inverse. One flaw defines the whole person. When someone makes a bad impression, our mind attaches that flaw to everything about them. We stop seeing them as complex and instead reduce them to that single negative trait. If they are late once, we decide they are irresponsible. If they speak awkwardly, we assume they're unfriendly or incompetent. The flaw becomes a filter that colors all our perceptions. Instead of judging each behavior separately, we let the initial negative trait shape the entire picture. This happens fast and often without awareness. Imagine meeting someone who seems quiet during a meeting. You might think they are uninterested or unprepared. Later, when they contribute a great idea, you still view them through that first impression. You might believe the idea was a lucky moment. The initial flaw, being quiet, sets the tone. In reality, they may have been thinking, observing, or simply nervous. The horn effect ignores context and locks people into labels. The bias shows up at work when a manager sees an employee make one mistake. From then on, the manager watches them more closely, expecting failure. If they do something well, it is overlooked. If they slip again, it confirms the manager's belief. The horn effect does not just create negative opinions, it reinforces them. It blocks second chances and growth. In school, a student who struggles early may get labeled as lazy or slow. Teachers may expect less from them. The student senses this and stops trying. The horn effect becomes self-fulfilling. The student might perform well in another class or context, but the label follows them. One weakness overshadows their other strengths because the negative trait defines them. The bias can appear in friendships or family dynamics. If someone lost their temper once, they may be seen as the angry one. Even when they act calmly, others stay guarded. They are not allowed to change. The horn effect freezes people in their worst moments. It denies the possibility of growth, healing, or context. It also plays out in customer service. If a waiter makes one mistake, a customer might tip poorly and tell others the service was terrible. They forget the rest of the experience was fine. The flaw dominates the memory. A single bad interaction outweighs multiple good ones. The horn effect shapes reputations based on isolated events. The bias is powerful in hiring. If a candidate answers one interview question poorly, the interviewer may assume they are unqualified overall. But stop noticing strengths. They may end the interview early or ignore other positive traits. The first flaw becomes the entire story. This causes talented people to be rejected because of a single misstep. In politics, the horn effect drives polarization. One mistake or unpopular opinion gets amplified until the entire person is seen as bad. Supporters of the other side ignore all their strengths. They reduce them to that one flaw. Nuance disappears. The horn effect makes enemies out of people who may have useful ideas or good intentions. The bias also affects how we see strangers. If someone dresses differently or speaks with an accent, we may judge them without realizing it. If they make one awkward comment, we decide they lack social skills. This bias fuels stereotypes. We take one trait, appearance, background, habit, and use it to define the entire person. We stop seeing individuality. Social media intensifies the horn effect. A person can make one comment that gets taken out of context. The internet reacts. The flaw becomes their whole identity. People ignore their history, intentions, or complexity. They are judged permanently for something temporary. The horn effect becomes public and unforgiving. The bias goes further when mixed with memory. We remember negative actions more clearly than positive ones. If someone disappointed us once, that memory stays sharp. We forget times they were supportive. When we see them again, the negative memory takes over. The horn effect combines with negativity bias to create strong, lasting judgments. In relationships, this bias destroys trust. If a partner forgets an anniversary, the other person might think, they don't care about me. They apply that belief to future situations. Even when the partner shows love in other ways, the flaw remains center stage. They are viewed through a lens of failure. The horn effect prevents forgiveness. Sometimes the bias is subtle. We may not openly dislike someone, but we treat them with less warmth or patience because of a single negative trait. We might avoid collaborating with them. We might dismiss their ideas faster. Our behavior changes even if we do not voice the judgment. They feel the rejection but may not understand why. The horn effect also works internally. We do it to ourselves. If we fail once, we might label ourselves as incompetent or lazy. We let one mistake define our entire identity. We ignore our strengths and focus only on our flaws. This blocks confidence and growth. The horn effect becomes self-directed and we shrink our potential. Parents can unintentionally use this bias with children. If a child struggles with math, the parent might say, "You're just not good at numbers." The child believes it and gives up. The horn effect turns one challenge into a permanent identity. The child stops trying because the label feels permanent. This limits development and motivation. The bias can also appear in reverse situations. If someone outside our group makes a mistake, we judge them harshly. If someone in our group makes the same mistake, we excuse it. In-group bias protects our own, while the horn effect punishes outsiders. This combination increases division. People feel unfairly treated based on identity rather than behavior. The horn effect often feels justified. If someone annoyed us, we believe our judgment is accurate, but annoyance does not equal truth. We might misunderstand their intentions or see them at a bad moment. Everyone has flaws, but the bias turns a single flaw into their entire personality. This limits compassion and communication. In leadership, This bias is damaging. A leader who dislikes one team member might block their opportunities, criticize small mistakes, and ignore achievements. That team member becomes demotivated and performs worse, confirming the leader's view. The horn effect creates problems the leader thinks they are merely observing. It can also distort how we evaluate performance. If an employee makes one big error, their whole track record can be forgotten. They may be passed over for promotion even if their overall performance is strong. The horn effect erases nuance. It turns people into one-dimensional characters in our minds. The bias shapes fairness in justice systems. If someone has a criminal record, people may believe everything they do is suspicious. Even when they try to rebuild their life, society views them through their past mistake. This makes reintegration difficult. The horn effect denies people second chances. To make it worse, the horn effect spreads through gossip. One negative story gets repeated until it defines the person. The context gets lost. Listeners accept the label without meeting the person. Reputation becomes based on one moment instead of overall character. This can damage lives and relationships. The horn effect can also influence how we treat strangers in everyday interactions. If someone cuts us off in traffic, we assume they are rude or selfish. We do not consider they may be distracted, stressed, or in a hurry for a serious reason. We take one action and use it to define their personality. We do not offer the same grace we want for ourselves. In education, this bias can affect how teachers distribute attention. If a student misbehaves early, the teacher might assume they will always be disruptive. They may watch that student more closely and interpret neutral behavior as negative. The student feels targeted and may live up to the label. The horn effect shapes academic identity. Some people experience this bias because of appearance. If someone looks tired, people assume they are lazy or unprepared. If they speak slowly, we think they are unintelligent. If they are introverted, we think they are cold. The horn effect takes one trait and turns it into a judgment of the whole person. Understanding this bias helps us pause before defining someone. It reminds us to see individuals as layered, not reduced to a single moment. The horn effect feels like certainty, but often it is just a shortcut. When we slow down and look deeper, we often find that people are more capable, complex, and human than the flaw we first noticed. Authority bias leads us to trust people in power more than we should. When someone appears to have expertise, status, or authority, we tend to believe their words and follow their instructions, even when logic or evidence does not support them. This bias comes from a deep-rooted survival instinct. For most of human history, following leaders helped maintain order and avoid danger. The mind still uses this shortcut, assuming that people in charge know best. But authority does not guarantee accuracy, fairness, or competence. When we rely on status instead of critical thinking, we give up our own judgment. Imagine being in a meeting where a manager presents an idea that has clear flaws. You see the problems, but no one else speaks up. The manager sounds confident. Everyone nods. You start to doubt yourself and stay quiet. Later, the project fails for the reasons you noticed. Authority bias kept the group silent. The title of manager made the idea seem smarter than it was. This bias shows up in classrooms. Students often accept everything a teacher says without questioning it. Most teachers are knowledgeable, but they can still make mistakes. When students never challenge or think critically, they learn to rely on authority instead of developing reasoning skills. The bias creates passive learners who trust positions more than information. In the workplace, authority bias can lead people to follow harmful orders. If a boss pushes employees to cut corners or ignore safety rules, some will agree without hesitation. They assume the boss knows what they are doing, or that it is not their place to question. This can cause serious damage. History shows many cases where ordinary people followed harmful instructions simply because someone in power told them to. Authority bias also influences health decisions. Patients often accept everything a doctor says, even when they are unsure. Most doctors are trained professionals, but they are still human. They can overlook symptoms or misdiagnose. A patient who assumes the doctor is always right may not ask questions or seek a second opinion. This can delay proper treatment. Trust and expertise is important, but blind trust can be dangerous. Advertising uses authority bias to influence choices. Companies hire experts, celebrities, or people in lab coats to promote products. Even when the person has no true expertise in the product area, their perceived status makes people believe the claims. A sports star might promote vitamins. A famous chef might sell cookware. Their success in one area creates the illusion of knowledge in another. Authority bias makes the message feel credible. In legal settings, authority bias can affect fairness. If a police officer or lawyer presents evidence with confidence, jurors may trust their version over others, even without strong proof. A witness who seems educated or well-dressed may be believed more than someone who seems ordinary. The appearance of authority can outweigh the facts. This can lead to wrongful judgments. The bias also affects politics. Voters often believe leaders simply because they speak with authority. The tone, confidence, and title matter more than the content. A politician might make claims with little evidence, but people accept them because they hold power or represent a trusted group. Authority bias makes it easy for leaders to manipulate public opinion through image rather than reason. The effect appears even in subtle settings. When someone speaks with a strong voice or wears formal clothing, we think they know what they are talking about. Studies show people are more likely to follow instructions from someone wearing a uniform than someone dressed casually. The uniform acts as a symbol of authority. People comply even if the request seems odd or unnecessary. Authority bias also appears in family dynamics. Children often accept their parents' beliefs as truth without question. This makes sense at a young age, but as they grow, it can limit independent thinking. Adults may continue following family expectations, even when those expectations cause stress or conflict, because the authority of parents feels powerful. The bias keeps old patterns alive. In group discussions, people often wait for the highest-ranking person to speak. Once the authority figure shares their opinion, the rest of the group aligns with it. This shuts down diverse ideas. The best solutions rarely come from authority alone, but authority bias keeps people from contributing. The group mistakes hierarchy for insight. Authority bias also influences how we evaluate information. If a statement is backed by a well-known institution, people assume it is accurate without checking the source. This is useful when the institution is reputable, but it becomes a problem when people misuse authority to spread misinformation. Someone might say, "Experts say," without naming them, and others accept it. The phrase "experts say" triggers trust even without proof. This bias becomes stronger when we feel insecure or uncertain. In unfamiliar situations, we look to leaders for guidance. If we are stressed, scared, or overwhelmed, we stop analyzing and start obeying. Authority offers comfort. It tells us what to do. But in those moments, we are more likely to make poor choices because we ignore our own observations. Authority bias can silence valid concerns. If someone questions a leader, others may label them as disrespectful or difficult. This social pressure discourages critical thinking. In many cultures, challenging authority is seen as rude. People learn to stay quiet even when they see problems. This creates dangerous environments where mistakes go unchallenged until it is too late. Sometimes authority bias causes us to assign expertise to the wrong people. For example, celebrities often become spokespersons on social issues, health advice, or science. Fans trust them because they admire them. But fame is not the same as knowledge. The halo effect and authority bias can blend, making us mistake confidence for competence. Authority bias also appears in religion, mentorship, and self-help cultures. Leaders who speak with certainty may gain unquestioned loyalty. Followers may believe everything they say, even when it goes against logic or ethics. The desire to belong and feel guided makes people hand over their critical thinking. Authority becomes absolute power in the mind. Even body language can create an authority effect. Someone who stands tall, makes eye contact, and speaks decisively appears more knowledgeable. Two people can say the same thing, but the confident speaker is believed. The quiet or unsure speaker is dismissed. Authority bias makes delivery more important than content. This bias also influences how we treat ourselves. When we see experts or leaders act confidently, we compare ourselves and feel uncertain. We assume they are superior. We downplay our own knowledge, even when we are right. Authority bias makes us doubt ourselves and overvalue others. Despite its dangers, authority bias often feels comfortable. It saves time. Instead of researching or analyzing, we let someone else decide. But comfort can cost us. It can hide the truth, silence good ideas, and lead to mistakes we could have avoided. The key is not to reject authority, but to balance respect with reasoning. True experts welcome questions. Good leaders invite feedback. Authority becomes dangerous when we stop thinking for ourselves. Authority bias lives in the moments when we say, "They must be right because they're in charge." When we notice that thought, we gain the chance to pause, examine the facts, and make our own judgment. Survivorship bias makes us notice success stories while ignoring failures. It tricks us into believing that success is more common, easier, or more predictable than it truly is. When we only look at the winners, we miss the larger number of people who followed the same path and did not succeed. This creates distorted beliefs about effort, talent, strategy, and luck. We celebrate the survivors, but forget the countless others who tried and disappeared from view. Our judgment becomes skewed because the examples we see are not the full picture. Imagine looking at famous entrepreneurs who dropped out of school and became billionaires. People point to them as proof that passion and risk-taking lead to success. If they did it, anyone can, they say. But they do not mention the thousands of others who also dropped out, worked hard, and failed. Those stories are invisible because those individuals did not become famous. Survivorship bias makes dropping out look like a smart move, when in reality, it is a huge risk. We focus on the rare winners and ignore the majority who did not make it. This bias affects how we view business advice. Many books are written by people who succeeded and want to share their secrets. They describe their habits, mindset, and strategies as the reasons they won. But they rarely know about all the people who used the same strategies and failed. Their advice might be helpful, but it is incomplete. Success often depends on timing, connections, and luck. Factors survivors do not always recognize. Survivorship bias hides the role of chance, because only the successful voices get heard. In history, survivorship bias shapes our understanding of progress. We remember the inventions that changed the world, but not the thousands of prototypes that failed. We celebrate groundbreaking discoveries and ignore the years of trial and error behind them. This can make success look fast and genius-driven. It downplays persistence, experimentation, and failure. Survivorship bias rewrites the story of innovation, making it cleaner than reality. The bias also appears in media. News outlets love stories about people who achieved greatness against all odds. They profile athletes, artists, and entrepreneurs who never gave up. These stories are inspiring, but they omit the thousands of people who also never gave up and still did not reach the top. When we only hear the success stories, we think hard work always leads to reward. This can create unrealistic expectations and self-blame when things do not work out. In fitness, we see dramatic before and after photos. We assume the program works because of the visible transformations, but we do not see the people who followed the same program and failed to get those results. Survivorship bias sells the illusion of guaranteed success. The company highlights the few who succeeded and hides the rest. In war, an example of survivorship bias is famous. During World War II, engineers examined returning planes to find where they were most damaged. They planned to reinforce those areas, but a statistician realized the planes that got hit in other areas never returned. They were shot down. The visible damage represented survivorship bias. The real weak spots were the ones without holes on the surviving planes. This example shows how dangerous it can be to only study survivors. In the workplace, survivorship bias influences hiring and promotions. Leaders may study the behaviors of high performers and try to copy them across the company, but they ignore the people who had the same traits and did not succeed. For example, they may think confidence leads to success because successful people appear confident. But many overly confident people failed. Confidence alone is not the cause. It may just be a visible trait of those who happen to succeed. If leaders only examine the winners, they build strategies on incomplete data. In education, people admire top students and assume their study habits are the reason. They ignore others who studied just as hard and did not achieve the same results due to stress, personal issues, or differences in learning styles. Survivorship bias reinforces the idea that success is always within control. When it is not, people feel shame instead of recognizing the complexity of achievement. Survivorship bias even affects our view of aging. We see elderly people who are healthy and active and assume their lifestyle choices kept them that way. They walked every day, or they ate this diet, people say. But we do not hear about people who made the same choices and still faced illness. The survivors shape the story, but they are not the full sample. The bias makes longevity look more controllable than it is. This bias also appears in investing. People study the habits of the richest investors and assume their strategies always work. They forget about investors who used the same strategies and went bankrupt. Survivorship bias makes high-risk strategies look safer than they are. It hides the failures, which are often more common. When new investors copy the winners, they may face losses they did not expect. In careers, we celebrate those who followed their passion and made it. We do not see the many who followed their passion and ended up broke or burned out. Survivorship bias makes passion sound like a guaranteed path, when it is really one piece of a larger puzzle. Sometimes the survivors themselves do not even know why they made it. They may credit their discipline or creativity, but timing, trends, and support networks often played a bigger role. In art and entertainment, we know the stars, but not the thousands of talented people who never got noticed. A musician becomes famous, and people say, they're successful because they are gifted. But many gifted musicians remain unknown. Survivorship bias hides the randomness of exposure, marketing, and luck. It makes the success story look like destiny. Even in technology, we admire companies like Apple, Amazon, and Google. We study their culture and methods, but we forget about the countless startups that tried similar things and failed. Survivorship bias makes these companies look brilliant rather than lucky in timing and opportunity. When other businesses copy them, they often fail because they do not have the same conditions. Survivorship bias makes us notice success stories while ignoring failures. It tricks us into believing that success is more common, easier, or more predictable than it truly is. When we only look at the winners, we miss the larger number of people who followed the same path and did not succeed. This creates distorted beliefs about effort, talent, strategy, and luck. We celebrate the survivors, but forget the countless others who tried and disappeared from view. Our judgment becomes skewed because the examples we see are not the full picture. Imagine looking at famous entrepreneurs who dropped out of school and became billionaires. People point to them as proof that passion and risk-taking lead to success. If they did it, anyone can, they say. But they do not mention the thousands of others who also dropped out, worked hard, and failed. Those stories are invisible because those individuals did not become famous. Survivorship bias makes dropping out look like a smart move, when in reality, it is a huge risk. We focus on the rare winners and ignore the majority who did not make it. This bias affects how we view business advice. Many books are written by people who succeeded and want to share their secrets. They describe their habits, mindset, and strategies as the reasons they won. But they rarely know about all the people who used the same strategies and failed. Their advice might be helpful, but it is incomplete. Success often depends on timing, connections, and luck. Factors survivors do not always. Recency bias gives more weight to the latest information than what came before. The mind pays extra attention to what happened most recently and treats it as more important or more accurate than older information. This shortcut can be helpful when the most recent data truly is the most relevant. But often the most recent event is just the loudest, not the most meaningful. Recency bias can distort judgment, influence decisions, and hide the bigger picture. Imagine a student who has performed well all semester. They study consistently and score high on every assignment. Then they do poorly on one final quiz. Instead of recognizing it as a small setback, they panic and believe they are failing. They forget all their earlier success because the most recent result feels more real. Recency bias pulls attention toward the latest moment and ignores the long pattern of good performance. This bias also shows up at work. A manager may judge an employee based on their most recent mistake rather than their overall performance. If the employee had months of strong work but missed one deadline yesterday, the manager might think they are slipping or unreliable. Recency bias makes the manager forget the employee's consistent value. As a result, decisions about promotions or responsibilities become unfair. In relationships, recency bias affects how we remember interactions. If a partner has been supportive for years but had a bad day and snapped, the other person might feel hurt and assume the relationship is declining. The negative recent moment overshadows the positive history. This bias can cause unnecessary conflict because people react to the latest emotion instead of considering the full context. Recency bias also influences how we view ourselves. After a bad day, we might say, "Everything is falling apart," even when most days have been fine. A single argument or failure can convince us that we are losing control. The mind exaggerates recent pain and forgets previous stability. In this way, recency bias fuels anxiety and self-doubt. In decision-making, recency bias is especially powerful. People often base choices on the most recent experiences, even when older experiences provide better evidence. For example, someone who won money the last time they gambled may believe gambling is profitable. They forget the many times they lost. The recent win feels stronger than the past losses, so they keep gambling. Recency bias gives false confidence and ignores long-term trends. Investors are strongly affected by this bias. If the stock market has gone up for a few weeks, they believe it will keep rising. If it drops sharply, they panic and sell everything. They judge the market's future based only on the most recent movement. This leads to buying high and selling low, the opposite of good strategy. Long-term data often tells a different story, but recency bias keeps people focused on the latest swing. Sports fans do the same. If a team wins a few games, fans think the team is unstoppable. If they lose their last 2 games, fans think the season is over. They forget the full record. Coaches can fall into this as well. They may bench a player after one bad performance, even if that player has been consistent all season. Recency bias causes overreaction to short-term events. In hiring, recency bias shows up during interviews. The last candidate interviewed is more likely to stand out in memory, simply because they were most recent. If an earlier candidate was stronger, they might still be forgotten. The interviewer's brain treats the final impression as the most important. Without notes or structure, recency bias can lead to poor hiring decisions. This bias even affects memory of conversations. If someone ends a conversation with a kind comment, we remember the conversation as positive, even if it began awkwardly. If it ends on a negative note, we remember the whole interaction as negative. The ending moment holds more weight than the middle. This can shape how we judge people based on small final details, rather than the entire experience. Recency bias also impacts motivation. If someone recently failed at a task, they may believe they are not capable, even if they succeeded many times before. The brain holds on to the latest failure and forgets past competence. This can discourage effort and stop progress. The bias convinces people they are stuck when they are actually just reacting to a recent dip. In education, recency bias affects testing and grading. If a student improves toward the end of a course, teachers may view their performance more positively overall, even if they struggled earlier. On the other hand, if a student declines slightly at the end, the teacher may assume they are disengaged, ignoring prior excellence. Recency bias can influence grading fairness unless the full timeline is considered. Advertisers and media companies take advantage of recency bias. News outlets highlight the latest events, knowing people will treat new information as urgent or important, even if it is not. Headlines repeat recent stories to shape perception. People react to the newest data without comparing it to long-term patterns. This leads to public overreaction and emotional decision-making. In health and fitness, recency bias shapes self-image. If someone eats healthy all week but overeats one night, they feel like they ruined everything. The mind ignores the progress and fixates on the most recent slip. This often leads to guilt and giving up. Recency bias hides progress and exaggerates setbacks. In long-term projects, recency bias affects evaluations. A team might start strong but hit challenges near the end. Leadership may judge the project harshly based on the final phase, ignoring the effort and success earlier. The most recent struggle becomes the story. Conversely, a project that begins weak but finishes strong may be praised, even if the majority of the work was flawed. Recency bias distorts performance reviews. This bias also appears in personal reflection. When people look back on the past year, they focus on what happened most recently. If the last month was stressful, they say the whole year was bad. If the last month was joyful, they say it was a great year. The brain compresses complex timelines into the latest feelings. Recency bias shapes our memory and mood. Even in parenting, recency bias can influence decisions. A child may behave well most of the time, but misbehave once, and the parent might react as if the behavior is constant. They may issue punishments based on the most recent event, not the overall pattern. This can damage trust between parent and child. The child feels misunderstood, and the parent feels frustrated, all because of one moment. Recency bias also fuels impulsive choices. If someone recently saw a news story about a rare danger, they may take extreme precautions. If they recently heard about a trend, they may jump into it without thinking. The latest information becomes the most convincing, even when it is misleading or incomplete. The bias can even influence hope and fear. After a recent win, people feel overly optimistic. After a recent loss, they feel overly pessimistic. In both cases, they misjudge the future because they anchor on the present. Recency bias makes emotions louder than logic. One of the biggest problems with recency bias is that it often feels accurate. Recent events are easier to remember, so they feel more real. Older information fades, even when it is more reliable. The mind confuses vividness with truth. The new shines brighter, but the whole picture is what matters. When we train ourselves to step back and look beyond the latest moment, our judgments become clearer, calmer, and more accurate.